And so begins the next live stream. This is the nameless protagonist. So before I get started, I want to offer respects to the sphere. Os. To the dojo. Os. And to those that are able to enter in today, or if you're listening on the playback, I appreciate you joining me. Os. Last week, or rather the last string that we did, we went over the purpose of what the hidden village concept is going to represent. And I wanted to take some time so that could be clear for any new people that come in and listen to this, or whether or not it needs to be referred to in the future. But the week prior to that, we reviewed the word katas, sword form 1, relating to social dominance theory, form 2, which related to the environmental mastery, which broke down the concepts of the civilization outpacing the speed at which the culture is able to actually address it, and how the two subsequently form the field that we call environment, be it physical, be it natural, or be it social. And moreover, we went into a little bit of detail in the systems that govern it, with the goal of trying to reach equilibrium. And lastly, we went over sword form 3, which dealt with, it was named the Demon Gate, but it dealt more so with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, specifically the pyramid that was produced about a year or so before he died. And we focused on the bottom 4 needs, which were decided to be paramount in a human being's ability to cope with life. And how when those needs aren't met, individuals, instead of depending on the environment from which they came from, specifically the culture, then they'll find some way to take it for themselves. Thus, the Demon Gate. The intention of these forms is to form a kind of verbal martial art, a rhetoric that allows an individual to ascribe another frame of reference to have a lot of these conversations without actually personalizing these things so that they turn into ad hominems, or to avoid the problem of dogma. I think having an effective framework to communicate ideas that we deal with on a regular basis on the sphere is beneficial not just to you, but to the aggregate, and moving the conversation forward. Because oftentimes we miss the greatest advantage that we have by having multiple perspectives. And that's, instead of it having work in the spirit of conflict to destroy, it can be used in the spirit of trust to actually construct something that you otherwise wouldn't be able to do on your own. It's with that intention that we push forward into the next sword form, 4. It is labeled the Illusion of Exclusion. We'll take a little bit of time to acknowledge some of the folks that have made their way in. You know, it'll probably take a little bit for folks to kind of really get up there, but definitely want to give a shout out to Snuggles, who's in here. Glad to see you. Os. JBA, back into the building again. I definitely appreciate you, fam. Peace. Os. We got Sigma Jones, one of the Black Ronin. I see you, family. Os. And Lionel, glad you could make it in also, fam. And definitely glad you could catch me live. I know seeing me in rare form. I'm usually on other people's panels all the time, but yeah, this is a regular thing. So definitely keep an eye out. I try to keep these in the Hidden Village folder on my playlist. So if you ever miss it, you don't see it in the general suggested on the general portfolio when you look at my video section, go to the playlist section and look for the segment that's labeled Hidden Village. And you should find all the live streams there. There are also other tabs if you want to take a look at the scrolls I've done as they pertain to philosophy. And the social commentary section is also there in the playlist under the tab of Makimono or scroll. But to get a little bit of an outline, you guys can definitely take a look at the description. I've added some information there that might be useful so you can get an overview of the points we're going to be covering in general as they relate to the fourth word kata. So before I get started, though, are there any questions before I kick things off? So we got Marco here. Os. Yes, Lionel had mentioned the illusion of exclusion. I think I kind of got a little bit of inspiration from Malcolm X when he had that statement of the illusion of inclusion, and that kind of phrasing got a little bit catchy. And I definitely understand the context under which he made that statement. And I think when we went over sword form 1, specifically with social dominance theory, we definitely explain what's going on there when Malcolm X speaks of the illusion of inclusion. That is classic third tier arbitrary discrimination, out-group experience, especially as it pertains to men. But with this particular form, it may rub a lot of people the wrong way. I know that oftentimes when we get into conversations in the space, we speak about a very critical and important concept that we hold very highly here, and it's the idea of accountability. And we know that from the general environments we stream from, and the notion as it's presented is that accountability is some form of option that, certain people are over expressed or over expected to demonstrate, while others essentially get a free pass for seemingly no other reason than they don't have a Y chromosome or they belong to a special group of people. This sword form is not an attempt to circumvent an individual's accountability. And I want to make that clear from the very beginning. Accountability is paramount. Without it, you're nothing more than a minor. Even minors have a measure of accountability that they need to ascribe and hold to themselves. This is not an attempt to circumvent that. The purpose of this form is to really demonstrate the multifaceted and the higher resolution picture of reality that the world around you really does have, that many people on reflex, and because of the way the brain tends to break things down to their lowest common denominator, this reductionist ideology, that when it comes down to bringing that image back up to full size again for the purpose of extrapolating useful information to problem solve, you run into problems because you've downgraded and you've watered out, you've drained out, you've depixelated the image to the point where it is a shadow of what it formerly was. Things are more complicated than just an individual. The individual, and I'll make this bold declaration, that the individual and what we identify as the individual is nothing more than the shadow of the group who is casting it. In other words, getting back to this word that's in the first segment here, Mbuntu. It's a Bantu word that, depending on where you go on the continent, translates to this word person or people. And there's a very popular axiom I really, really like. It states, Mimi ni mtu kwa sababu kuna watu, which translates to roughly, I am a person because there are people. And I think that's the spirit of what it is this sword form is trying to remind you of. That nothing exists in isolation, nothing exists as a singularity. There is absolutely a plurality to everything. And that plurality may even give function to a trinity or a trichotomy, even in some instances. But we won't really get into that right now. Maybe another time. But the point to highlight is that, yes, you are an individual, but you are also part of an aggregate at the same time, irrespective of whether or not your level of awareness acknowledges it or not. You are still a part of that. And when we get into conversations in the space, oftentimes, we tend to, in this odd habit, I guess it's just a human thing, but it's more so I see it happen in the West. And it's in the developed West in particular that this tendency, this reductionist tendency to hyper focus on the individual and individuality at the expense of the aggregate prevents people from recognizing problems that are individual, systematic, and how these systems play back down to the individual. And we're going to go over some of these things when we break down the particle wave collapse that happens with the individual versus the aggregate. That's the first point. We're going to examine closer this concept of the individual being a shadow of the group or a shadow of the aggregate in point 2. When we get into the 90-10 principle of your actual biology, we'll be examining what are you. At point 3, we're going to take it even further and get into the decision-making process of the brain and review the neo and allocortex, their purpose and their function. Relate them to the definitions of force and power, what the differences between them, why they matter, and how it projects out to the aggregate, how the group essentially is a superorganism. And this will be a term that we revisit probably again in the future. I know some of you may have heard BGS talking about this as well, somewhat, but I definitely want to get people familiar with this word superorganism because I think it's very important and it'll support a deeper conversation we have later with the concept of the hive and the direction that I think society is heading towards after the alphabet movement. We'll elaborate on that at another day. But this last point here, the self as a modality of orientation and the need for subculture, which is what I call this space in general, a subculture. Why it's important, why you shouldn't shirk away from it, and the advantages of having that so that you can, as a self, as a person, as an individual, improve and truly express and be who you are. With the outline done, we're going to go ahead and give a couple more acknowledgments since more folks have made their way in. I see Gyogami has made it here. Os. Toya the Tutor. Glad to have you here again. Os. Kareen's here. You see you there, fam. Wagwan. And we got West Coast, one of the 3 magi. Thought I had you modded already, fam. Glad you could bow in today. Os. Chaos Reign. What's going on, fam? Glad to see a villain representative here. West Coast, go ahead and type something, Magi, and see if that went through. We got JC the Conqueror that just stepped in. Os. All right, there we go. Okay. So with that said, I guess we'll get started with point number 1. So this micro-macro plurality paradox, it's a mouthful. I didn't know any other way of trying to articulate it, but I notice it when we have these conversations, when we speak about the individuals that are supposed to be held accountable for their actions. And oftentimes, we're looking at problems that are the result of something that could only occur through the cooperation of groups of people. And we simplify it down to a person is left making a choice. They decide to do something or they don't decide to do something, and then that's it. And if something is wrong, even though there is a massive amount of people that are making these same choices that may not be in their best interest, that even though they may share a common denominator in a place from which they came from, that because they made this choice, it's on them, no further discussion needed, they just needed to choose better. That's a little bit too much of an oversimplification of the real world. Many times people recreate what it is they have from where they came from. And a lot of what you understand to be a positive or a negative choice really is influenced by what others are there that can present and frame the decision you're going to make. This idea of bad and good, many of these notions we get in our development. And there's so much of our physiology, there's so much of our decision-making process that is left really on a whim and by impulse. And so it's difficult when you get the two issues conflated of self and group. In reality, both share a measure of influence. And there is a mutual influence amongst the others in the form of context. Meaning if someone is there and observing, the way you behave generally could be different than the way you would behave if nobody was there observing. And we can see this in social experiments done left and right. You can see it growing up in your own children. You can see it in your own development. You can see it where human behavior is very largely contextual. It's not this static thing that everybody walks around with and is this grand exception. Human behavior and even the world around you is far more dynamic than that. You are simultaneously an individual with agency that can choose, but you are equally able to be influenced by your environment and especially those who are around you. You are neurologically and genetically predisposed to do it. And believe it or not, the particles that form your physical being operate exactly the same way. This is why context, the ability to gather details, the ability to examine critically, and the ability to create frames of reference to yourself and your values are very important to making consistent good choices, consistent decisions. But it's this issue of tending to behave differently under observation that got my attention and got me to calling it the concept of particle wave duality or individual and aggregate collapse. Can I get a 1 in the chat for those of you that are familiar in general with the particle wave collapse or this double slit experiment that was made really popular with string theory? Just a quick one if you're familiar with the idea. So I'll definitely break that down. And while you guys are hitting the button, got a few more acknowledgments here. We got Dwayne H. Os, rocking the Dr. Doom. Kareem Austin. Os. We got BGS Ibmore. One of the Shidoshi in the space. Glad to see you. Os. Roguish Sun. Glad to see you, fam. Glad you can make it through. Shade Tree Therapy. I think it's the first time I've seen you, fam. Welcome. We got BR Charles. Glad to see you, fam. And I'm just going to call that Ankh. I'm not sure who that is, but glad to see you, fam. Ishtolo. And yeah, we're definitely going to break that down in just a second. It's a pretty fascinating experiment, and it kicked off what we understand about particle physics, and specifically quantum physics. Getting into a lot of technology that's knocking on everybody's door right now. Lastly, Sao Sheik, I see you, fam. I'm glad you could make it. So again, we highlighted the fact that human beings have a very interesting tendency to behave differently under observation. And there's a great deal of context that determines the outcome of what that even looks like oftentimes, both in the past and in the present. So as we understand the double slit experiment, it was an attempt to observe particles, and to get an understanding of particles. Particles are the lowest or the smallest fundamental aspect of matter that we generally acknowledge. When matter can still be identified as matter, we identify it as a particle. And these particles go up the chain to help construct more complex forms of matter that equal out to the physical reality that we recognize in our third dimension on a casual level. So the key thing here is to look at particles as the smallest measurable component that we generally have in physics. And the electron generally is what's preferred. The electron can be identified as one of these interesting particles that people like using to observe the quantum world, or the world that is smaller than what you see beyond the molecular level, going even smaller than even the atoms. So what they did with this experiment is initially they took a single sheet of paper and they made a slit, and behind it was a wall which they were going to use to record the information. And they took a projector that could shoot particles, and they shot particles through the slit. And what they expected, obviously, was for as those particles go through the slit, it was going to make an even pattern at the end of it, which corresponded to the size of the slit roughly. It's what you expect if you took a bajillion baseballs and just threw them at a wall, and you're aiming at a specific point at the wall every time as best you can. And in general, you're hitting the same spot. Over time, let's say those baseballs have ink, they're going to leave a pattern that's pretty consistent. It'll have a straight line. What they decided to do was do that with the particles, and then they did it with energy. They could do the energy version of a particle or an electron, which ultimately is a photon. So they did these photons, and they did the same sort of deal where they projected all these energies and try to go send it through that slit. Let me take a step back. First, they use water, actually. How water, if you flick it, it creates a wave. That wave in the water creates these ripples, and these ripples would go into the slit. I think that's the better way of describing it. As those ripples go into the slit, they create what's understood as an interference pattern. And against the wall that they're trying to record this symbol as, the end result looks kind of like a wave pattern or a frequency wave rather than a straight slit. So instead of just one slit, they applied two to it. And they wanted to see what the difference would be between the two. And what they expected is with two slits, the physical matter, the particles, should just create two separate slits. And they expected the energy, the water, as it goes through those double slits to continue to make interference patterns and just keep looking like it creates a wave function or a vibration function, a wavelength, as you could probably call it. And what they found was as they shot particles through both of those slits, instead of getting two columns, they got a wave interference pattern that was just like what they had with the photons or the water, which was odd. This was physical matter. It shouldn't be behaving like energy. And so they tried to figure out what was going on. They thought, okay, well, maybe what's happening is because we're shooting the particles so fast between the two slits, they're actually interfacing with each other, bumping against each other, and creating a wave pattern that way. You know, it's just chaos. Like you just set off a grenade of marbles somewhere and they just scatter everywhere. And, you know, these marbles or these particles are bumping into each other and whatnot. And that's what's creating these waves. So they shot these things one at a time. And what happened is as they shot these particles one at a time, leaving it no way that it could be bouncing off of each other or anything like that, they found that they got the exact same wave pattern that they received with the water and the photons. That was completely bizarre. So it became very evident that something odd was going on with this experiment. They said, look, there's no way we've got matter acting like energy. I don't care how small it is. This doesn't make any sense. Something fishy has to be going on. So what they did was, after confirming that, you know, this particle is behaving like energy, basically, he said, look, let's get a measuring device here so we can make sure we know every time one of these things goes in, nothing fishy's happening. So they get a really, really, really small observational device that can record every aspect of this particle going through these slits. And they redid the whole experiment the same exact way. They didn't change anything. And what they found was interesting. That when they did the experiment while they had the recording devices tracking trajectory, tracking in real time, it did exactly what they expected it to do the first time, which was each of those slits simply had a straight column of particles up and down. And they said, wait a minute, are you serious? So we didn't do anything different, and now these particles are acting like they're supposed to, going straight in through the slit, no interference patterns, no weird movement. Then they remove the observation device after they tried it several times before. And when they removed the observational device, they got the same wave pattern. And this gave rise to a principle that is very profound that speaks about potential. It is known as superposition. We got a couple. Go ahead and give a few folks some sword rights in the spot. So if you guys see any bots here, I think you guys know the deal. You are free to engage. But superposition. And what that meant was, as the particle was leaving the device which projected it, it was existing in a quantum state known as superposition, meaning that it was existing in two places at the same time. It would split, go through each slit potentially, and interfere with itself. And that's what was creating the wave pattern. But the moment you observed or the moment you gave perspective to that particle and you looked at what was taking place, it behaved precisely as you would expect it to. And instead of being in that superposition, it collapsed from superposition into an expected physical state and behaved accordingly. This is exactly what Einstein called spooky action at a distance. It's interesting. And it corresponds to so many principles in not only our psychology, but group behavior and individual behavior and dynamics of how the universe even works. A few years ago, they were able to actually confirm the existence of superposition. It had stayed theoretical for almost a century. Almost a century. Until a few years ago when some kids in college were able to place particles in a state of superposition, several hundred particles in a state of superposition. And now they're working on having more complex forms of matter being in a state of superposition. And it's this concept of superposition and being able to be in two places at once and collapse to a point that you expect them to. That is the foundation of quantum computers. It uses a form or a dynamic known as the qubit, and it keeps that qubit in a state of superposition. It is a positive and a negative simultaneously. That is the literal definition of potential. It ties back to this idea of behavior, choice making, decision, context, circumstance, projection. Where you came from is a profound indicator of where you're going. And this lays the context for the potential decisions that you might make and the frame under which you might make them. And systems represents this idea of many forms of observation that can and do influence what you decide to do as an individual. For some, almost to the point of questioning, are you really making a choice, or was that choice just made for you and you're in a position or a process of trying to rationalize why you made it? For those of you familiar with The Matrix, this is a theme that is covered ad nauseum within that series, particularly the first three movies. But that's the principle that I'm speaking about when I talk on the individual versus aggregate collapse, where people will take issues that do and really are a matter of a group and collapse it down to one person. And what happens is when you do that, you can find every reason in the world to blame that person for a problem that really is systematic. And it doesn't help you in trying to solve the problem, because systems need systems to solve problems. They are matters of homeostasis and equilibrium. And an individual can't solve that. The only thing an individual can do is respond to it. And generally, they're going to respond based on the frames of reference they've been exposed to prior. I think this is a good transition point to start looking at section 2. But before I do, I'll go ahead and make some acknowledgments and some more folks that came in. And if you guys have any questions about what we just talked about, definitely say something in the chat and I'll jump to that. Ishdolos. We got the broke genius here. Os. The truth is I know it. Glad you can make it, family. Os. Aria, glad you're here. We also got the number one grinder. Os. Valeri's here. Glad you're here, family. We got a Lindy sighting here. What's going on, family? Os. Sunclaw, peace to you too, fam. Appreciate the Michelangelo. Os. So no questions on the micro-macro polarity or plurality paradox. How at the same time, yes, you are an individual with agency, but yes, you are also an individual that is certainly part of the aggregate. And that aggregate does influence you, but that doesn't mean you can't influence the aggregate in turn. You just need to be aware of the context. When geez, I see you, famos. Okay. Point number 2 is getting into a little bit of microbiology. Let me see. Roger's son put something up. The bonds, are they avoided more than they are unknown? Can you define what you mean by the bonds? Are you making reference to, because I don't want to presume what you mean. Are you speaking about the relationship that the individual has with the aggregate? And Salshik has the right idea. We went over that when we talked about Sword Form 2, Environmental Mastery. He says, with us and our individuality. Yes, and we'll actually get a little bit more into that with the fourth point, where we talk about the self as a modality of orientation and the need for subculture. I think that many of us in this space lose the bigger picture and fail to see sometimes that we're not, for as much as we are different, we are also still the same, but at the same time, we hold a lot of labels that we didn't decide. A lot of us are in this position because of what has happened to us. And a lot of these things began before we were even born. So if we've got all of these things that are contextualizing our existence, and the world around us is already making decisions for us before we even have the cognitive ability to make a decision, that's what I mean about our general relationship with the aggregate as far as the individual is concerned. Your individuality is largely based on that upbringing, especially in that critical 7 years. And it's augmented with the experiences that you have, which create a frame of reference for you. That's where you get your worldview from. But these things are built from things that also came from somewhere. And for you to experience that, it's literally your sliver of existence being compared to and contrasted with everybody else's sliver. They're kind of inescapable. So yes, you can identify you as an individual. You've got a physical form you can point to. You've got a history of action, but you didn't create that independently. And I think that's the point that really is being emphasized here, that the individual isn't really independent. They're on their own, depending on the degree to which they would like to be. But you can only get so far, especially in this modern era. And a lot of what makes you you only goes so far. There is a lot, an overwhelming percentage of you that really isn't you, but an aggregate. And I think that's a perfect point to step into this second point here. I speak about the 90-10 principle of human biology. I'm going to make a pretty interesting statement. after they did the Human Genome Project, which I think most of you are familiar with. I think they started it in 96 and they finished in 2000 something. May have been 2001, but they managed to synchronize and break down the entire human genome. And they noticed something very, very immediate once they broke that down, that there's a lot of pieces missing, in that there's a lot of things left unexplained. Yeah, they broke the whole thing down and they got most of it sequenced. They can point to this gene and that gene. But for those that are really diehard Darwinian, you know, the evolution of species and all of that, it's interesting to find out that the monkeys that we supposedly evolved from, they got more chromosomes than we do. In fact, not only do they have more chromosomes than we do, human beings have roughly the same amount of chromosomes as an earthworm. We are as complex as an earthworm. An earthworm. I mean, an earthworm. It got real humbling really quickly after that. If there's nothing we learn about nature, it's that at its core, it is profoundly lazy. Profoundly lazy. And there is a lot that takes place that just follows the lowest common denominator to get things done. I'll break a little bit of that down when we get into epigenetics, because that's one of the key things that makes us different and makes us unique and makes us who we are and separates us from the rest of the animal kingdom. In other words, we're running on the same PC as an earthworm. It's just that we've got way more data than they do. That's the only difference. We're able to make masterpiece structures out of Legos. Oh, man. But even our cells, our individual cells, the cells that actually contain DNA within the human body, there's only 10% of the cells in what you call your body that are actually comprised of your DNA, that are actually the result of your DNA. It's crazy. 10%. And even when you get into the interesting aspect of your actual cell, and I think we've all done, elementary biology. So we know we've got your cell's got the nucleus. Your nucleus is where all the DNA is at. It's where, you've got your ribosomes and all of that print your proteins and all that. You also have the energy source within the cytoplasm, which is outside of the nucleus, which is called the mitochondria. I'll spell that because I talk about mitochondria a lot. It is the so-called powerhouse of the cell. It has the interesting ability to convert oxygen to energy. Whereas your cytoplasm, which is the other part of your cell, it takes glucose and does the exact same thing, just way less efficient, way, way less efficient. And that's an extremely important point, because the mitochondria, billions of years ago, used to be its own microorganism. It was something that was totally in and of itself in the microbiota world. And at some point, it fused with other cells, and they became a singular celled organism, meaning the cells in our body, we wouldn't even have the energy to do what we do if it had not been from an adaptation to combine two separate cells. The cells that contain the nucleus and the actual mitochondria in and of itself. So the mitochondria is essentially a graft that allows the cell to truly function in the way that it needs to in more complex organisms, especially mammals. What's interesting is there are many functions that you have that you call you. You can look at your body and say, I'm me. And in a linguistic sense, that meets all definitions that's required for it. That's the best low definition form you can use. You'll get most of the work done that you need to when you refer to yourself as I. Point to your body, yeah, this me. I have a problem, you can say. That's when you run into some problems. You have to problem solve. The issue is, if you have a problem, you need to define and apply context to what you mean by that. Let's say you've got a cold. You keep coughing. Yeah, it's accurate to say you've got a problem, but there's more to you than just you. You are a series of systems that are aggregating with each other to comprise the system known as you. And with this cold you have, and all of that extra mucus that's suddenly building up that you're coughing up, is indications that you have a problem, not just you, but your cardiovascular system has a problem, pulmonary issue. You've got to address some issue with your lungs and the system that is associated with that. With that information, you're able to go in and actually begin the process of problem solving. Now you've identified the area which is struggling, and if you continue to ignore it, it will spread out and cause problems for other parts of your system. In the case of pneumonia, you could have an issue where the phlegm just starts to seep into places it's not supposed to. And if it gets into your bloodstream, it just wreaks havoc. Inflammation starts happening everywhere. You have all of these reactions where your body's trying to cope, and you end up shutting down. There is a measure of codependence that these systems have in order for what is identified as you to function. I think it's interesting how it goes even deeper, to where a lot of the bacteria, or the cells rather, I should say, again, we only said that 10% of your body is actually you. That other 90%, that other 90%, going back to the Human Genome Project, there's actually no genome to deal with the functionality of a lot of those systems. We have what you can call a primordial on switch and off switch. We can flip a switch on and say that's supposed to function, and when it's functioning well, this is what it's supposed to look like. But we actually don't have a genome to actually address the way under which that takes place. That gets outsourced to bacteria. That bacteria, including your immune system, including some parts of your neurology, which we'll get into later, is recruited by microbiota, bacteria that have nothing to do with your genetics. Absolutely nothing. It is, for all intents and purposes, a foreign entity that is helping your body function because you don't have a genetic script to actually make it function. You just got an on switch and off switch. Oh man, that, to me, that was a big eye opener. And it's for this reason that it sparked a very big endeavor that's taking place right now, known as the Human Microbiota Experiment or Initiative. And I encourage anybody, when you get time, to please look that up. The amount of profound information that they're discovering about all of these different microbiota that exist in your system is life-changing. Not only in the way they're able to address medicine now, but the way you can live your life and the way you may actually be hindering yourself and offering yourself chronic diseases that are being passed on because the microbiota, largely a huge amount of which you get from your mother during child development and birth is being compromised. That ties us back to, the beginnings of how people get here. And to give you a little bit of a preview, even on that, bacteria that's in your gut, a lot of the seeding for that you actually get when you pass through the birth canal. As you're crying and screaming, the baby's mouth is open. That's how they get exposed to that first bit of bacteria that helps develop the bacteria that they require so that they can have a complete digestive system. It's pretty interesting. That's getting into also the role of breastfeeding. How a lot of that bacteria that's in the mother's gut, it actually attaches to the immune system. And immunocells that baby needs to kickstart its own immune system follows the immunocells into the bloodstream. That's how it gets a hitchhike. Makes its way into the breast milk, and that's how the baby gets access to it. But what we're seeing now in the developed West, oftentimes, is if the mother's not on a garbage diet, which they generally are, for the most part, unfortunately, they're getting C-sections. So they're not getting exposed to that bacteria that's in the birth canal. And if they are being breastfed, it's not for the 6-month recommendation. They're getting formula, which doesn't have any of these things. And so their relationship that they need in the spirit of trying to provide something that is more sanitary, in quote, they're missing the purpose as to why these processes were done like this by nature in the first place. And it's creating chronic issues, such as obesity, such as predisposition to diabetes. And it's interesting because this is happening not in kids that are 5 or 6 years old that are old enough to, get exposed to the food. It's happening to 9-month-olds, 6-month-olds. Diabetes and obesity. And what they're finding is when they can do things like stool transplants, when they can change the microbiota that's in the gut, they've been able to cure a lot of those problems. Cure. And if not, greatly reverse. The human body, as we understand it as this individual that's just a slave to their genetics, is an idea that was born at the time where eugenics was being pushed and being used as a scientific justification to rule over other people. And they were animated in this spirit of trying to justify supremacy. And so it's as a common habit, they would use the science to try to rule it. Well, come to find out, human beings and DNA are not as important as we thought. Things that are going on in the environment and other things that have been recruited by the body to allow for it to function because the body can't do it by itself are not only important, they're causing people to die early deaths. They're causing people to suffer from non-communicatable diseases, which in the ADOS tribe, the ADOS social complex, that's probably our biggest killer. And we're the main ones that jump full swing into a lot of these modern things that are causing these problems, and we're not even aware of it. But it's absolutely being studied on right now. And solutions are being implemented to address them on a regular basis. I find that profoundly interesting. Profoundly. It's an understanding that even what we play or see as our bodies, ourselves, we're far more than just that. You are a walking aggregate of systems that constitute the entity known as you. In other words, from many, you become one. And that's why I highlighted this principle as the individual being a shadow of the aggregate. It isn't to take away your agency as an individual. It isn't to downplay the concept of the individual. It's to say that if you want to collapse the individual to an individual, yeah, it'll behave like that particle did. But in reality, at the same time, it's still functioning also as a wave. You are more than just you. And ironically, this 90-10 dichotomy plays a lot with how your thought process works, your brain. And that'll be the very next point we get into with point 3, getting into the neo-allocortex dichotomy, explaining the difference between force and power, and showing how when human beings aggregate, they form the social complex known as a superorganism. We'll get into that briefly. But I'll go ahead and pause right now for some acknowledgements. And if you guys, again, have any questions, again, just feel free to say it in the chat. Let's see, we got TL showed up. See you, fam. Dante Whitaker. See you. Let's see. TL says, does that go to say that we've evolved to an extent where we no longer need the quote count or have emerged into a more refined genome sequence? No, I think what's happening, or what it is to say, is I don't think it's a matter. Well, it's the product of optimization, but it's more like a lazy dynamic. And we're going to get into that with the Neo and Allocortex when we break down how our genetics make shortcuts to solve very complex problems. Very complex problems. We'll do a live experiment with you guys in a moment to kind of really emphasize the point. Adrian Thomas, I see you. Currently, right now, I just have the Cash App, but I can work on getting a PayPal set up in the future. I appreciate you stopping by, fam. Lee Ali, I don't think I saw you, but mitochondria has its own DNA descending from the oldest microbiota. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And our cells make great use of that mitochondria. And we definitely make great use of that, adopting melanin to our bloodstream and its ability to absorb energy from the sun. And it makes great use of the carbon dioxide that we make as a byproduct, that chlorophyll, which can in turn turn it into more oxygen. But that'll be for a conversation we have when we get into the Nameless Path content. See, McDrama Bear. I always laugh when I see that name, fam. I appreciate you stopping by. Says mitochondria in your cells actually communicate through chemical messaging with the gut microbes that affect and alter the nervous system in your GI nervous system that affects your CNS. Indeed. And we are going to be getting into that very shortly, or rather, we may get into that on the bonus content where we talk about the allocortex, the vagus nerve, the gut, and the Sphinx. So you're definitely on the right track. Gyogami says, teaching in our school, quote, if an elder versed hidden things referred to himself as we instead of I, it's because they are aware of the many within one. That incorporates the spirit of what we're talking about precisely. From the many, there is one, and from the one, there are many. It is absolutely reciprocal, definitely not one-dimensional, definitely cyclic, most likely a spiral. Reminds me of time. Kareem states, did you hear about the Canadians that are studying the human waste of some Africans to study their gut? Oh, yeah, they've been doing that forever, fam. It's one of the first things they look into when they do any kind of investigation on people, especially now. It's very common. And they found a lot of different species are native to, certain groups of people. For example, there's a particular microbiota that people have adopted that came from the seaweed that people digest out there, and it allows them to extrapolate more resources and minerals and vitamins outside of that. Something I should go ahead and break down also is, the microbiota is important because we understand that we don't create certain vitamins in our system. What actually happens is the bacteria that's in our system takes the raw ingredients that we consume, and it actually uses those raw ingredients, and as a waste product, those vitamins are produced, and then they're able to be absorbed into the bloodstream correctly. So what you're eating makes a very, very big deal. Very big deal. Roger's son asked, how much erosion can that naturally suffer? Can one naturally suffer, I'm assuming he's saying, before there's a permanent loss of that connecting bond value? There's a lot of literature that kind of gets into isolation and the effects that isolation has on an individual while it's taking place, and then afterwards when that transpires. It's strange because, generally speaking, when you have a subconscious need for something, you generally start acting in a way that will put you in a position to actually acquire it. But in the case of, for example, isolation, oftentimes people start acting worse. They end up becoming more antisocial, when in reality you would think it'd be the other way around. But people get more antisocial the longer they go without that connection. And I think that there's a lot to say with regards to that. And there's a difference between that connecting or being connected and having that measure of isolation. Because it is true that we're in a constant state as social creatures of evaluating and reevaluating our social standing. Because being part of a group, there are some downsides to that. Part of that is the built-in kill switch. A lot of our cells, we have this on a cellular level, which is interesting. The built-in kill switch, and it gets into a concept I debated whether or not I wanted to talk about or give it its own topic, which is group selection. And it's something that creates an interesting phenomenon that we're seeing more in the modern world. I think I'm going to dedicate a video to this topic because it's so related to what we saw with the mouse utopia experiments, and what I think is, why the hive model is being rolled out as an answer to the behavioral collapse, where when an individual is so far down on the totem pole, aspects of their physiology will start to break down. And it's thought that the reason why there's this self-destruction policy in place, this kill switch that's built into the cells, is so that the individual can sacrifice themselves for the group. And it's something that defies natural selection and sexual selection, where certain characteristics that would help the group as an aggregate succeed end up being selected for, rather than things that would help the individual in their quote genes, or the selfish gene theory, succeed. And part of this group selection is when you're in a situation where you're that far down, you would rather have one less mouth to feed so that the chances of survival for everyone else go up under certain circumstances. That's something that's very primal and very baked in to not just us, but social groups as a whole. And scientists have been observing this for a very long time now, and it's pretty interesting. But that's tying into kind of what you're asking, Rogish. It's a matter of group selection, potentially. So you might find a lot of interesting information if you take a look at that when you get time. But I definitely plan on going into more detail about group selection in the future and examining that kill switch factor, because I think it's very relevant in the modern era. Oh, Ray, no problem, fam. Let's see, we got Sister Sada here. I see. Glad you could join. Os. A particular level of base mothering became the standard. I guess he was talking about when I was getting into the way people are birthing now, with the C-section and the formula and whatnot. So folks are not getting the microbiota they need. We got J Bones here. Ghana's here. I appreciate you, fam. Shade tree therapy. Doesn't the same thing happen when those cells lose their ability to communicate with others? Yeah, we broke that down. Os. Salshik asks, how would the quote metaverse affect culture? Us. I briefly covered that in the scroll where I reviewed herbivore men and dry fish women. I spoke about this concept known as isekai, or the other world. I want to revisit that. I want to revisit that, and it may be, I may share it with the group selection concept. Maybe a greater meta video is warranted this topic, because I've got a lot to say about that. We kind of touched on it a little bit as well when we got into the transhumanist conversation, which we're going to have to revisit also, because there's too much stuff that we talked about in that video. It's only been like a year and a half maybe since we did it. Maybe not even a year, actually, thinking about it. Probably hasn't even been a full year yet. And a lot of the things we were talking about, a lot of this stuff is becoming funded and mainstream. But there are many people who are venturing into the metaverse as a form of leaving behind the physical form that they have now. So, we're back to this concept of identity, which is going to be important. I think because of the way the brain works and its general inability to tell the difference between reality and fiction, that the metaverse is going to serve as a new form of reality that people are going to exist in. And what's going to have to happen is, as a result, we're going to need to become bilingual with these forms of existence, because people are going to have a physical existence and they're going to have a meta existence. And the irony is, and I think we talked about this before, Gyogami, and the need for initiation, where the metaverse is going to perform or act in the same role that in antiquity, the spirit world, in quote, functioned and served. And when you think about what the spirit world served as and what people were able to do and the psychological functions that were met with having a frame of reference, a concept such as the spirit world, the metaverse is going to serve the exact same function for people. The difference is many people are going to choose to view that as the real world. Because you can take everything I said about the individual effectively being a shadow and use that as justification to abandon your body, which would be missing the point of life. But soon that's going to be up for debate. And it won't be us debating. It's going to be individuals in Generation Alpha and Beta and their kids. Because neurologically speaking, they're going to be making connections and having existences with those avatars in the metaverse or whatever form that's just like that, and have more ability to relate to that than they're going to relate to their physical selves, which is profoundly unfortunate. But it gives the framework for the hive dynamic to work. But Gyogami, that part right there. But that's already happening now with some folks with in the gaming world. Kids right now that are growing up with tablets in their hands and they don't even have a full grasp of language, at least not verbally. They're not making the neurological connections to properly communicate. Yeah, we definitely covered a lot of this in the transhumanism conversation. I have a section on my channel on the playlist now where I have a lot of the places where I was featured at and had some of those presentations. So if you get time, Saushik, I almost want to say you were there. You can definitely go back and take a look at that stream that I did with Dr. Nicole Ali. Definitely due to do another one with her in the near future. So fam, you ain't ever lie. Black Man Being brutally honest says pretty soon it'll be like that movie Surrogates. Man, that's facts. But go ahead and jump on. Let me see. Also, before too much time passes, West Coast African has sent in a Cash App. I appreciate you, fam. Let's see. And Charles Irby, glad you could join us. Yeah, that that I think was a very needed conversation because we were having a difficulty in the space telling the difference between what epigenetics was and eugenics. And that's a problem. That's a very big problem. It could be a tool that you use to imprison yourself, or it could be one of the most profound means by which you liberate yourself. It's literally a matter of perspective. But like we said before, people recreate what it is they have from where they came from. And what most people are going to be ending up doing with a lot of this stuff, unfortunately, is renegotiating the conditions of their enslavement. It's very unfortunate. They'll be doing it willingly and happily. But I'm digressing slightly. So we'll go ahead and jump on to point 3. And it's a little bit dense, I guess, but it's very easy to understand in concept. The truth is, I know it made a statement earlier about free will effectively being an illusion. And to a great degree, I agree with him. I wanted to bring our attention to the brain, specifically the organ that we call the brain, what it is and how it's organized in a very interesting poetic kind of relationship that the brain has and plays with what we call thought. The one part of our brain that separates us as human beings from other complex organisms, and especially mammals, because I don't believe anything other than mammals has this. A neocortex. The neocortex consists of basically 90% of our brain gray matter. What you think of when you look at a brain, that's effectively your neocortex. It's the newest portion of your brain. It just got here, and it's responsible for a majority of what you call thought. You're using it to listen to me. You're using it to move around. Well, let me not say that. You're using it to infer and understand and sense the world around you for the most part. It contributes to what you call thought. Generally speaking, it's like a big giant tablecloth sheet that's been balled up together and stuffed in your cranium. And each section of it is responsible and has its own little job. And it's got its own network of cells whose job is to just basically store memory. And it kind of operates almost exactly. And it's freakishly almost exactly like how Windows work on a Windows operating system. If you want to learn something, your brain creates a folder for it. and it will associate everything that's similar to it with two parameters, a what and a where. Those are the two dimensions that the brain uses to constitute and construct the entire world you understand. It needs a what and a where. Ironically, that neocortex is responsible for spatial awareness. Everything that you can consist of and think about when you use this word think, that is the neocortex. That is, volume-wise, 90% of your brain. Then there's the much older and much more powerful Allocortex. Well, it only has 10% of the brain. You will physically be able to do absolutely nothing if your allocortex is in any way compromised. When you see someone that's paralyzed, generally speaking, there's an issue in the channel of control as it relates to the allocortex. Either some nerve has been cut off that leads to it, and we'll get to that nerve later, well, a bundle of them, or there's some sort of physical deformity or short circuit that has occurred dealing or pertaining to the allocortex. And within that allocortex are other, I'm going to call them hemispheres of power. And they relate to a lot of things that are connected to what they call the autonomic nervous system. It's a series of things that happen with your body that are very largely involuntary. If it has to do with any system in your body, and I mean any system, even your emotions, and especially your emotions, that's called your limbic system, where a lot of that comes from. And even the so-called lizard brain that controls your automatic reflexes, I think they call it the medulla oblongata. I think that's part of where you get your automatic reflexes and whatnot for. Or in the esoteric spheres, they call that whole line the channel of control, or the serpent power, that we call it ninjutsu. All of that root chakra stuff, all of that baseline thing, the things that are responsible for your physical movement, your heart beating, your intestines from squeezing and doing what they do, your circulation, the way you breathe, all of that. That's your allocortex. So what's interesting is that I spoke about how nothing gets done without it. So much so that even though that allocortex is only 10% of your brain, it does 90% of the work for you. 90% of the work of the physical body, maybe even more, even the choices you make, are influenced by that allocortex, especially the limbic system. And I'll spell that out because a lot of people who are familiar with neuro-linguistic programming, a lot of people that are familiar with neuro-linguistic programming or NLP are very familiar with the limbic system and what it does. Essentially, when people are saying you're being emotional or you have your fight or flight response, it's the limbic system that's kicking in and making those decisions for you. In fact, so much so that blood gets cut off to the neocortex to a great deal and saturated in that allocortex when you're in those crisis states. If you want to look at the way things play out, what it really means is, and I made reference to this a little earlier when I said that the human body, the chromosomes that constitutes our DNA are no more complex than that of an earthworm. And what it suggests is a lot of those older parts of the brain, they develop and they favor something that is serpent or worm-like. In other words, that allocortex, that old, if you want to call it animal brain, functions a lot like that, and it anchors us to the animal world. And it is the most powerful part of our brain. And most of the neurology that we have, when we evolved to gain more complex functions, it's not like they replaced the older system and, added a new one. They kept the old system, they just added more layers on top of it. And so what we have right now is this old dinosaur worm-like wiring as a baseline, and then all of these different augments. It's like what happens when instead of downloading a new form of Windows, you just get the update version. You just add on to it. So here you are with this PC that's, originally started with Windows 95, and here you are with Windows 12, like, yeah, I just got the update. I mean, that's the human body. And I'll give you an example of this. Take your hand and just place it in front. Like, if you want to act like you were about to, play slaps, but, your hands are placed on the bottom, and just look at your hand. And what I want you to do is ball a fist up real quick and then release it. And once you do that, I want you to try to move your pinky and to curl it like it was a fist, but only move your pinky. Don't move any other fingers. And for the overwhelming majority of you, unless you are a genetic miracle, it is almost impossible, or is impossible, to curl just your pinky without your other fingers curling, especially your ring finger. That's a matter of neurology. The reason why that's happening is because we only recently evolved a need to move that finger independently, that pinky independently. For the majority of our neurological makeup, we've needed to ball a fist more than anything else. So what happens is that neocortex sends a signal. Okay, I need to bend the pinky. Problem is, there's no output for that. Allocortex goes back and says, look, bruh, we only got fist or nothing else. So here's what they do. They send two signals at the same time. You're getting a simultaneous signal when you're trying to just curl your pinky to ball your fist, but then at the same time, relax it and isolate just that one pinky. It is so inefficient that it can't maintain it all at the same time. So it only allows for a certain amount of that, because the signal to make a fist is so much stronger. That's how inefficient our neurology is. It doesn't add anything new. It takes everything that was already there and it just slaps it on top of it all. And there's so many instances of that, where we've got all of this old automatic trajectory moving on factory settings that are adopted for an environment we're no longer in. And I talked a little bit about this when I got into Sword Form 2, speaking about environmental mastery and how technology is speeding up so fast that the culture is struggling to keep up. And so people are defaulting to older settings. And those older settings have people acting like cave folks. We got way more of that allocortex working, that animal brain working, rather than that neocortex, that higher thinking. To give you another example of how the two interface with each other, you got an opportunity to experience the conflict between the neocortex and the allocortex whenever any of you have tried to hold your breath. It is your neocortex that says, okay, I'm putting in the order for the body to hold your breath. And the allocortex goes, okay, fine. But then soon you start getting these physiological signals from the autonomic nervous system. And the neocortex is going, nope, keep holding the breath. And the allocortex is like, okay, but we got to reproduce, and we can't reproduce if we're metabolically dead. And in order to maintain metabolic function, we have to breathe. So neocortex, I'm going to need you to sit down. And what happens? You start breathing again. And even if your neocortex decides, well, damn that, I'm going to be He-Man. Your allocortex goes, okay, fine, then I'm going to just shut you down. And what happens? You pass out. This dichotomy is already happening within your own self. It is the definition of force versus power. And in the greater context of this sword form 4, talking about the illusion of exclusion and how the individual is a shadow of the aggregate, the neocortex, that's your willpower. That's your desire, your thought to assert control. It is your force. But at the end of the day, it still gives way to the much more powerful deciding factor of the allocortex, which is power. And that's the difference here. What we're talking about is the difference between force and power. And why that's important is individuals can be forces. But in aggregate, over time, with more, that's how you get power. And in the modern world, there's a great emphasis on force. People ignore power. They don't understand power. And the reason why is because, yes, there's a common denominator with the two. We can call it strength. You need strength for each of these things. It allows for you to enact and perform functions that you need to as a living entity in this third dimension. You need strength. But the difference between force and power is the difference between the neocortex and the allocortex. Force is strength that is sustained in an instant. It is a measure of time. That measure of time is just like that, in an instant. How much strength can you muster? That's force. Power, on the other hand, is how much of that force can you maintain over an indefinite period of time. That's a very, very, very different thing. Very different. Force can make change, but power makes differences. And that's the difference between an issue or the issue of the neocortex and its ability to apply force, and the allocortex and its ability to harbor and maintain power. Each of them have strength, but the difference is the scale as it relates to this modality of time. And it is profoundly important as to why not only on the microbiotic level this takes place, but why we become a fractal of that in the aggregate and form groups to get things done with power. The modern era glorifies the individual because they're great demonstrations of force. Well, people call them demonstrations of power, but power is observed over time. And people's scale of time and reference of time is calibrated to only respect force, not power. It's when you come to understand that both of these two things do play a role, and that adhering only to one will leave you in a state of being too short-sighted. That can be a key element to helping you in solving problems. And it's a key element in helping you to address a lot of the issues that you have when you deal with this issue of individual versus group. Your body works this way. The world works this way. That neocortex, effectively, all it's doing is asking the allocortex for permission. The allocortex, for all of the space that it occupies, all it can do is ask permission. And the allocortex decides whether or not it agrees. And tying into this with development and how we said that most of what you are is running on autopilot or impulse, as we say. That allocortex is the impulse It's the drive. And the neocortex is what counters that impulse. And when you understand the nature of trying to cultivate a balance between the two, and when you've been given good upbringing that aligns the goals of the allocortex with the values of your culture, you can make better decisions because your drive, your impulses are already aimed in the correct direction. This is why when you take a human being who has not been civilized amongst other human beings, they have critical problems in being able to relate in the society under which they were placed because their allocortex has been calibrated for an environment that they're no longer in. This applies to human beings, this applies to animals, it applies to everything. And what's interesting is a lot of these things can be passed down epigenetically, but that's another topic. The key here is that impulse, that drive, so much of it is inspired and inherited, yes, by the parents epigenetically in the womb, particularly by the mother. But it's cultivated by the environment under which they're growing up in those critical first 7 years. That's why if you're put on a negative path from the onset, that negative path is likely where you're going to end up. Why? Because your entire impulse drive is already aligned for failure. That isn't necessarily a death sentence to an individual's ability to make cognitive decisions. But it definitely makes things much more complex and harder than what they need to be, and set people on certain behavioral patterns that you probably recognize now, manifesting in the modern era, being the result of a lot of topics we have in this space. It's really worth reflecting on this dynamic, the role that the neocortex plays in relation to the allocortex, the difference between force and power, and how when people come together and they're able to align themselves where they should be with their unique frames of reference that are unique to them and talents that are unique to them, they function like a super system or a super organism. I think that point ties in directly to the last point I want to make to really close this out. The self as a modality of orientation and the need for subculture. And I'll go further to state as to why this space is a subculture and it is absolutely needed. And it is a key tool to help us reorient in a way that we can bring out the best that we are as individuals, rather than having to conform to a thing that really fundamentally isn't even us, and something that we're not even calibrated to even exist in, and to quite possibly undo a lot of the trajectory that many of us were set on and gain some more agency over that. But in the meantime, I'll go ahead and take a look at some of these acknowledgments. And again, if you guys have any questions, definitely about what I just talked about or broke down, definitely make a statement in the chat. Let's see. We got Rogerson says the metaverse will be the final Hail Mary to hold value onto this, hold on to the value set of this new world, which is becoming the old world, what it used to complain about. They've already had their first slave auction. Yeah. Yeah, but it's interesting how, you know, as the technology advances forward and people are too slow to react to it, folks default to older settings. So this new world is really the old world that they were crying about, just like you were saying. And we're going to see the emergence of technology basically being the new God. I really don't see a difference at this point. Yeah. It's a lot like Fifth Element and a lot of other dystopian things that are put forward there. Kareen, the general argument about eugenics, yes, but I'm speaking specifically about issues we were having in the space when I explained how epigenetics, really what it boiled down to was holding the past accountable for what's going on in the future, in the present moment. There's this idea that the past doesn't have any influence in the present, and that, since it's past already, that in general it shouldn't matter, but it definitely does. There's trajectories people get placed on, and sure, on an individual level you can collapse it to that, then okay, sure, it'll behave the way you want it to. But when you've got tons and tons of people, hundreds of thousands of people also making the same issues, it's no longer about the individual. This is a systematic issue. It needs to be addressed as a systematic issue as well. In other words, people need to stop collapsing a lot of those topics from being to an individual dynamic and deal with it on the wave-like level in aggregate that it was designed for and what created it. Because that problem is systematic, therefore. And I think Adam was addressing Kareen about that. Eyes. Yeah, the finger experiment. Yes, the finger curling is nothing more than a very inefficient signal to ball your fist. It is ball your fist and then don't ball these other ones. Relax the other ones rather than just a straight up, okay, just curl that one. Can't do it. It's pretty interesting. It's the glass ceiling for those with no soul. Indeed. Shout out to Dr. York. It's an interesting conversation one can have about that. Appreciate you, fam. I see you, Mr. Z. Os. Glad you can make it. You missed a lot of it, so you may have to jump back on the playback. But yeah, we'll go ahead and wind this down with this last point. It's pretty self-explanatory, but knowing what we know now and how the brain operates on a dynamic of having frames of reference, much like the folder system you guys are used to using on your PCs. You have a folder that's related to an idea and things that correspond to that particular concept. You throw it in a folder and it stays there. And those folders may have other subfolders. And the more experiences you come across, or references, they help shape your worldview. And what's interesting about it all is what we spoke of earlier about how the brain needs to use modality in order to navigate and understand. It needs a what and a where, and then it can process it. And because we need a what and a where, I think this is where we get the emergence of the self. Because there is so much data to understand and comprehend, in order to make sense of it, you need to have some point of reference in all of this data in order to be able to make sense of everything else around you. I don't mean to call the self a kind of crutch, but more like a construct, a mouse point, if you will. Without that mouse point, it's difficult to know where you are on the screen. I'm sure there's a way you could disable it. If you make it too small to notice, it's difficult to understand where you are in relation to where you want to be at. And so it's hard to make sense of sound, sight, smells, just everything. If you don't have a sense of self to orient you somewhere, it's difficult to orient the whole rest of the world around you. And that brings a very profound realization about the value that you do have within yourself. That you are unique on an intrinsic level. And if you're given the proper cultivation to understand who you are, there is definitely something unique you can bring and contribute to the aggregate. I would even argue that a lot of the problems we have in the modern world is because that step has been largely cut out from the human experience. with modern education, particularly the Prussian school system. And even now in the modern era, where most people are getting their self-identity cues from social media figures that they're being bombarded by, and they're being coaxed into conformity by their peers out of fear of being different. An old defense mechanism that goes back to what we talked about with sword form 1, social dominance order, where those who stood out, who weren't part of the aggregate, so-called, could find themselves labeled as being in the outgroup, unable to adopt. If you don't have a group under which you can aggregate under, we go back to what we learned about with group selection. You begin to lose position in that little counter in your brain that's tracking your social standing. And it starts the self-destruct mechanisms, the shutdown functions. Everything begins to break down. And to a greater or lesser degree, I think a lot of the modern world is really fearful of being in that position. So people put forward images so that they can give the image of having these dynamics of power or ranking, social standing. We see this in the form of filters, people altering their pictures, people fabricating their posture as it relates to that, indicators of status being more important than actually having the status in and of itself. These things are an outcry to try to stave off that kill switch. They lose their sense of self and find themselves in a position to where they need someone else to tell them who they are, a form of validation from the outside. I think many of us in this community have had to wrestle with this when we were effectively ousted in a certain sense for having particular views that we have, particularly in the adosocial complex. And it's not some dynamic that says you're some sort of failure. It's that you aren't on the wavelength. You aren't on the frequency. You aren't on that pattern that is recognized as being in that acceptable in-group. And for whatever reason, you find yourself in a position now to where you have to find a way to continue without that measure of validation from the group. And you learn how to find that within. It's what help constitutes and contributes to the red pill rage. It's a struggle that if people are honest about it, if they found a solution for it, it wasn't easy. And many are left with a very difficult question. Do they shut off the parts of themselves that seek to unite and link up with others? Or do they continue to embrace it somehow and find some other aggregate that they can really form and thrive with? I think this is where we find the natural need for subculture. Many of us that are in this space now are here for that reason. We're able to not only really get into what we are as human beings, we're able to identify that unique thing that we do have that can aggregate with other people to create something even more. I think that's the important part. And what's critical about this is in the adosocial complex, especially amongst men, we don't have a model, a cultural model that teaches us how to do that. I think I've gone into it before with some folks on the panel, breaking down the stay in your lane concept that really affects ADOS men, where we just do not have a cultural history of working with each other for the purpose of aggregating, not force, but power. We're not used to creating subcultures that are run by us, organized by us, and have the hierarchies determined by us. We're used to those hierarchies being set and on the conditional approval and validation of outside people, be it the dominant society or the women that are in the group. Even going so far as to state the definition of what it means to be a man directly in relation to the amount of women a dude can get access to. or whether or not the women approve of some action that we choose to do or choose not to do, or fear of not getting that validation or acceptance of. We've yet to truly create a subculture that can allow for us to continue to explore who we are so that we can put forward our strengths in a way that allows for them to be aggregated, so a system can be realized that can produce things constructively. We've definitely seen what the opposite can do. But it's also why I wanted to bring this up, due to some of the recent events that have taken place in the space, about some of these dichotomies that are being brought to the forward. Lipstick Alley, for example, has popularized and their conflicts with the likes of some Gen 1 folks like Sergeant Willie Pete, with bringing these ideas of the educated lame, the Pookies and Ray Rays, this kind of dynamic. I think it's important to realize that at the end of the day, these labels aren't things that we created. Other people made the decision to place those labels on us. And irrespective of how you identify with it or not, they're going to have those same dynamics, but we are free to label ourselves, and we don't have to adhere to that. But what we are talking about ultimately is many of us here do share a commonality, a common origin, but our values with regards to it differ. It's going to be a natural thing that when human beings aggregate, they're going to aggregate to those whose values are similar. And so we are at a stage of development, which is really what this is, where we can form subcultures out of a subculture. I'll say that again. We've grown to the point where we can have subcultures out of a subculture. And if we can recognize the things that we do share in common in the aggregate, the conflict that results from these subcultures can actually produce something useful. If nothing else, it helps give you a point of reference to understand what your values are not. And that gives you that much more of a degree of understanding of who you are, what's important to you, so that you can get to work constructing that. Because you are definitely needed, contrary to what the conditioning, contrary to what the dominant society, contrary to what your immediate environment may be telling you. You do have something intrinsic to you that not only can you develop, but would be important if it was shared with the aggregate. Because when one of us succeeds, we all do. It's just that we need to understand the definition of we. It's not we so that someone can extrapolate and take from you. It's not we so that you can be in this perpetual state of altruistic dumping. It's so that you can further develop what it means for you to be you, and to acknowledge the fact that while, yes, you are an individual, but you also do have an aggregate. And the success of that aggregate can be your power as well. All you have to do is contribute your aspect of force to it. The secret to overcoming being in the subordinate male position, as we described in Sword Form 1, is to form coalitions of those who are like-minded. And having done so, honestly contribute to yourself and contribute to the group as a whole. And that can be in many different forms, such as not hindering when you've got a common enemy and a mutual interest. It can be as simple as having these conversations. It can be as simple as not perpetuating BS points that slow things down for you and hurt everyone in the long run. I'm not here telling you what to do, but what I am saying is there are benefits to this. Yes, you need to have your individuality, But understand that at the same time, while you are an individual, you are definitely part of an aggregate. And you are here now because there is a subculture here. And that subculture here does have value. And not everyone is going to agree or have the same values, but you're going to find a lot that have a ton of overlap with you. And when it comes time to deal with the intersectionalists and the dominant society and all of the goofy fallout, all of the differing opinions, all of the different perspectives, these things will aid you because they provide means by which you can understand the scenario in front of you that may have been impossible if you were by yourself, because they were able to provide for you a completely different set of references that you couldn't present all on your own. But the good news is, once exposed, those viewpoints can become yours to utilize however you see fit, and they can be employed to defend, attack, or build however you see fit. That is the power of that dualistic nature of being an individual within an aggregate, and the power that the aggregate can bring to the individual in the form of what we call a subculture. With that, I think that concludes everything I want to really cover with the introduction to the nature of this word kata, what I call the illusion of exclusion. I greatly appreciate the patience you guys have had with me breaking this down. If you all have any other questions, I can definitely go ahead and answer those. And if there's anybody interested in jumping on the panel, let me know and I can drop the link and we can have a bit of a chop up session. And if you want, I can get into that last section that I have here, the little bonus section about the vagus nerve and all of that. Or I can turn that into a video if you guys like. But definitely let me know. I don't mind dropping the link. In the meantime, we'll go ahead and take a look at some acknowledgments again. Let's see. We got the Roger report showed up. Yeah, the ruthless nice guy. Indeed. Yeah, Roger. It's definitely helping getting that perspective out. And it's cool because you've got your account linked to Facebook. So you're bringing in people who normally wouldn't even be in the space oftentimes. And they're getting exposed to these concepts and they're able to spread. And I think that's a very important thing. Jeff R., glad you can make it here today. Os. Yeah, a lot of people haven't been getting my notifications, so I tried to put it in the community tab, and I put a story on my Instagram so people could kind of catch that. Some people caught it on the Instagram. Some people didn't even see the notification. But yeah, you can definitely catch the playback. That won't be a problem. Glad you could also join us. Let's see. Definitely glad you appreciate it, Aria. Let's see, we got Pookie. What's going on, fam?
What's going on, brother?
What's good with you?
Man, I've been chilling, man. I just got off Marcus's stream a minute ago.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to make sure the conversation we weren't divulging into the argument that you just mentioned. I'm not even gonna bring it up because I don't even want to. Because I just want to make sure that wasn't what it was about. I just want to make sure this is two individual niggas going at each other. This is Dennis and Marcus. This ain't that other thing. So
Right.
because we
Right.
don't need to be talking about that, and conversation like that's unproductive. And if that's that brother's argument, then that's his opinion, and it is what it is. I mean, he said it, like he ain't changed or nothing. I mean, it's not like this is new. So I don't see what the problem is. Y'all knew this.
Right.
So
Yeah. I mean, it's the same spirit of that. No, if you didn't catch what we were talking about earlier, you can look at the description. And I think the logic that leads up to this will make a bit more sense to you, Pookie. And you'll see why, we weren't animated by this idea trying to fuel that discussion that's really between them. I just wanted to highlight the point and the need for the subculture and how it's important as it relates to the individual.
true.
So,
Exactly. And I
yeah.
just wanted to say there's nothing we don't that exactly. And I was like, that's fine. I completely understand that. If that as long as it's just between y'all two and y'all not trying to make this a thing, because I mean, I think what Marcus was saying. I mean, in his defense, what he is saying, and I can agree with him that Dennis is pushing this. He's pushing it. So it's tough. It's tough, but it's not like this is a new kind of viewpoint of his. Like, I mean, we always knew this about Dennis. I mean, he ain't changed. I mean, he always really felt this way. And to be honest, I mean, he came up from a rough life. So I mean, I guess that brother has some years. I mean,
Well, that's what I'm
didn't he
talking
grow up in?
That's what I'm
Didn't he grow
talking
up
about with
there in L.A.?
conflict. He did. He actually broke down his whole origin story. I don't necessarily want to name drop up here. I want to keep things kind of, just strictly to the concept, because I don't want it to turn into a he said, she said, because folks sometimes, misconstrue topics. But the point
True.
is,
Okay.
like you said, that is his perspective. And I spoke on this when I said, conflict and good trust is productive, because there's a lot of interesting information that we learned from that conversation that people now can take and posture themselves accordingly. I know it hasn't changed my view. I've came out the gate saying it all. If you part of the ADO social complex, we're in the same boat. Even if you are adjacent, we're in a very similar boat. We're here for very similar reasons. And if those reasons differ, then I'm going to be in alignment with folks that are on the same page as I am. And I know who those folks are. And my content serves as kind of a beacon for that. And that's the lane I'm going to stay in and continue to contribute towards. I'm not here to alter anybody's freedom of speech, but I do want to offer a different way of looking at the bigger picture, because the details go missing oftentimes. There is definitely a need for the subculture. I definitely see why people want to create their own enclaves, but those enclaves don't necessarily have to be antagonistic to the point where they're destructive. They can and do oftentimes have potential to be very useful. You just need to know what subculture you want to stick to what you know best, and continue to be productive and be honest about what you're trying to put forward. And I think that gets recognized. Your people's actions speak for them, and you can see that consistency over time. I mean, there's certain names I could get into that, rub me the wrong way, but I understand the nature of who they are and I respond accordingly. And I don't let that get in the way of what it is I'm trying to do. And, it helps out in the long run when goofiness goes down, because we had an issue with the same person. Goofiness definitely happened and it was handled appropriately. And we gained some very useful data that we can use in the future. So that's just part of the issue I just wanted to bring forward with regards to that subpoint as it relates to this fourth kata here. But were you able to listen to most of it, Pookie? Or did you only catch that part?
Which one? What are you talking about? Which one?
When I started the stream.
Oh, your stream. Um, I've been listening. I've been listening for a minute,
Okay,
so
so you've
I
been
probably been listening. I mean, because I was on Marcus's shit, and you were kind of going at the same time, and
okay.
I was kind of talking to them niggas, and I seen you there, but I couldn't, like, I'm on the phone, so I can't, like, necessarily, like, so I was, but I've been listening for at least probably like 45 minutes,
Okay, so you
at
heard a
least an
good stream.
hour.
Okay. Yeah, you may like the beginning part when I get into the string theory and particle wave theory and break down the 90-10 principle. But I think you came in when I was
Oh
talking.
yeah.
Yeah, I think you'll like that. So definitely catch the playback, and if you get time, man, definitely leave a comment. I certainly would appreciate it, because in the
For
future
sure.
I definitely want to take some current events and give examples of these sword forms, in real time, because they're just rhetoric tools, man. So we can break a lot of this information down without having to be, personal with a lot of it, without it needing to be anything on the ad hominem.
True.
Yeah.
Cause it's like, I mean, like I'm we doing it like this. I'm like, all right, it is what it is. Like
Yeah.
he said, nigga, he said, end of discussion. I was like, it is what it is, bruh. I was like, goddamn,
Yeah, I
we in
understand.
the bucket, ain't we? In the bucket,
With them pincers going extra hard
yeah,
for no reason.
in the bucket.
Yeah, but I mean, we can break that cycle, fam. It's really just a matter of, if that's the environment, that's the environment you're calibrated for. That's what people are gonna recreate. But yeah, let me acknowledge some of these cash apps that came in real quick.
For sure.
We got BGS that sent one. I definitely appreciate you, sir. And Frederick Holiday came in with the cash app. I appreciate that as well. But yeah, did you
BGS tax.
have right BGS tax, man? But did you have any questions on what we spit on so far,
It's
or
with
stuff
the
that got your attention?
I mean, for the most part, I would say I mostly I agree with what you're saying with the general philosophy of how we get stuck into these ideologies and we get stuck off basing ourselves off unrealistic archetypes
Yeah,
that in reality no like person could actually be, because I mean you have your individuality, but I mean you have there are, I mean there is some similarities, there are some uniformities that we can acknowledge, but I mean not everything's the same. So I mean it doesn't have to be so personal. It doesn't have to be so gutta, man. I'm just niggas is putting niggas on posters and shit. They did. Hey, brother Marcus, what? My bad, brother. Keeping it was he was kind of doing him like how Anthony Ryan Logan was doing Donovan Sharp
mm,
with them covers, them Norbit
mm,
covers.
man. But again, it sounds like we're back to the whole beef. Well, I'm not gonna call it beef. It's it's the way people express conflict, but we're back once more to it looked to me like classic social dominance theory that I speak about with Sword Form One, man. And part of it is inevitable, but I think it's
hmm
important when people are conscious of it happening. And I think it can keep it from getting to a level where it just becomes completely destructive. You know what I'm saying? Because we do legit
Yeah,
have enemies, and like this ain't it. You know what
that's what
this
I was.
ain't
But oh my god, just like fucking, this is ridiculous. Like we ain't even like this is like imagine like you're just in the game and you're supposed to be fighting the sub boss, but you just keep
right,
walking into the wall. Like like what the fuck are we
right.
doing?
Free
Like what are we
damage.
doing right now? Like
Fucking up the
literally.
score. That's what we do. We fucking up the score. Talking about we going to be first
Talk,
place. Like,
and we talking about some nah nigga. I don't want to play that way. What you mean you don't want to play that way? That's what the fuck. What are we even doing here? Like if you just want to attack each other, you can do that shit. Where you at? Like we all live in damn near in the same neighborhoods, pretty much. I mean, we not all that spread out. Like come on now. These niggas, man, he talk about, well, let's be real, Dennis. This nigga talking about kill all the pookies and line them up when this nigga probably got pookie contacts in his phone right now. Let's be honest. Some of them niggas is his clients. Let's be 100. Because he comes from that neighborhood. So come on now. And
well,
he ain't
once
got no
again,
friends from the neighborhood.
there's a difference between the individual person that they're talking about and
hmm
the systematic archetype that's being projected here that we didn't even create. And every group of
Yes.
people has groups of people that are just like that, which is, I mean, when I hear certain things said, and this is all I'm going to say about this, I'm not saying anyone in
hmm
particular, not naming anyone in particular, but when I hear certain voice patterns used, certain concepts applied in a particular order. It reminds me exactly of what was said by the eugenics in the early 1900s. And the only difference ends up being the voice behind those words. And I think it's important to be very careful about who you're talking to specifically, and understanding how, when you have such a low resolution statement being made, it applies to a great deal. And if it's not animated in a spirit of trust and the desire to solve problems and be constructive, it will cause more problems than it fixes. I think Dr. Neely Fuller has a really great statement I like borrowing from him. He said, the object of solving problems is to solve problems without creating more. And I think that's kind of where it's at right there, man. This is all a matter of perspective. There's so many people who fit these archetypes. There's a cultural archetype for it in the American culture, in the American mythos. And it's really just straight up related to men being in the subordinate outgroup. And we already know that those individuals are the disproportionate targets of violence, negativity, and everything that represents something being repressed. And I think it's important to remember that aspect, that we're not very far removed from that dynamic at all. And we get reminded of that when we interface with different systems of power on a regular basis, whether it be economic, legal, or political. And I'm talking about us as a group. And it's important to, again, this is the whole theme of this concept of the illusion of exclusion. Power works in aggregate, not as individuals. Nowhere do you find power working off an individual dynamic. It is always expressed as a group. And if you don't have that, it's the principle that I described before a while ago about why 10 people with $100,000 are always going to be more powerful than that one person that has $1 million every freaking time. When it comes to actually applying power in the real world, those 10 people who are on the same page will always outperform and be able to outlast that one person with $1 million.
More hands, more minds, more productivity.
It,
Can't beat it.
it's it, you can't. You can't.
Can't beat it.
Networking, it scales. It's scalar. It's literally the difference between adding and multiplying.
Michael Jordan without Scottie Pippen is a nigga
Force
that just got
multipliers.
bounced in the first round.
Force multipliers. That's what that is. Force multipliers. And that's how
You
power
need
works.
them. You need
Absolutely.
them.
Because if you don't have those force multipliers, they're being force nullifiers.
Mike needed them just like we need them too. So
Indeed. Let me make a few acknowledgments real quick. We got E. Taylor 704. Glad you could make it. Os. Again, Fred Holiday. Appreciate you for the Cash App, family. And I got no clue what's going on with the notification. Appreciate you, Charles. I'm glad you liked it. Definitely leave a comment if you get time if you get time for the playback. NBA fan says peace to the chat. Didn't get the notification. It's the word today. Today we are talking about sword form 4, the illusion of exclusion. And in the description, I've got an outline of the points that we broke down. You're definitely going to want to catch the replay on that. And we get into the nature of how, yes, you are an individual, but at the same time, you are part of an aggregate. And that's exactly how not only you, your neurology and physiology, but the actual real world operates in all of its expression, in the natural world, the physical world as it pertains to infrastructure, and the social world as it pertains to society and societal constructs, such as institutions and social contracts, all of that. Let's see. Asada Muhammad asks, where can I find the video on transhumanism? Dr. Nicole Ali's page. So you can find it on hers, but my playlist section on my page, Sister Sada. If you go to the playlist, I've got a guest appearance section. And I've got all the places, all the interviews that I've done in that section. In fact, my entire page, again, is organized by playlist. So if you have a hard time finding something, I've got the playlist arranged by section. So if you go to Let's see, the spot that says guest appearances, that's where I have them there. Yume or the Dream, that's where I have a lot of my voice acting stuff at. Dole or the Way is where I keep all of my Eastern philosophy pieces. The Hidden Villages is where I keep the live streams that I've done, and the Makimono or scroll section. That's where I have all my social commentary. And I've got quite a few scrolls lined up because I plan on addressing a lot of different things that's been going on lately in the space and just in general, and really touch up on stuff. But
Excuse me, brother.
yes, sir.
I just wanted to say I just had a comment that did desire to make, but
Okay, go ahead.
I do respect your request for ambiguity on this channel. So with that being understood, I have noticed that a certain set of YouTubers, or I guess personalities on the space that have been on certain big channels that we know of, went on to a panel lately complaining about their channel receiving support. Now, I went to this specific channel and I noticed that there was, it just objectively, a lack of consistency up until a few weeks ago. And their content was objectively non organized. Now, I did this independently. I gave these brothers a fair shot, and I went to their channel and I look, and I'm subscribed to these brothers in their certain channel, even though I don't necessarily agree with one of these brothers because of his certain way of communicating and articulating himself when emotional. But with that being said, I still wanted to be objective. So I just wanted to say that. What do you think about that situation? If you understand what I'm trying to reference to you.
I'm not familiar with that particular situation, but if I think BGS said it before, people are upset about not being supported. They just need to continue to put the content out and be consistent with it, and it'll get the response. I don't know what the issue is. Um, if people are feeling what you're saying, they'll support it. It's just really as simple as that. And
He was
if they're trying to produce something to get attention, that's one thing. But if they're doing it and they're presenting something because they believe they have something of value and they can demonstrate it, it speaks for itself. And even if nobody likes it, if they're doing it and it's what they enjoy doing, you know, people will respond to your passion for wanting to do it. So I don't know if I'm missing something, but to me that looks pretty cut and dry. They just need to continue to do it consistently and wait for the end results, because if they want to make a paradigm shift or if they're looking to have some sort of systematic change, again, as an individual, that's not going to happen. They need to at least be the change they want to see, right? And then consistently present that.
so I was, I mean, I was just if, as ambiguously as I could possibly refer to this channel as, I
Which I
guess, the
appreciate,
trust
by the way.
channel. No problem, brother. The trust channel. The subject they were talking about was finance, economics. Um, just general information, real estate, crypto, anything. Stuff the black man needs, and I completely agree with that. What I suppose what we, and I guess you already referenced BGS. So I mean, is that cool if I reference BGS on the
Yeah,
panel?
yeah, everybody's already known. Yeah.
Okay, well, since you already referenced what BGS had stated, what we were trying to generally express on the stream recently, the last weekend. If I mean, you probably should go back. It's one of the local guys. It was, what was that? Was that yeah, that was, what was that? Because that was Saturday. That was Saturday night, and because those brothers had some words for another brother, another YouTuber, commenting on their trust channel and basically saying that their content wasn't consistent and that they're objectively not entertaining. Which, I mean, it is what it is. I mean, you don't have to be necessarily entertaining to release content on YouTube. But I mean, you can't necessarily get mad if it's not like drawing the attention that you want. I mean, it's not really anybody else's fault but your own. I mean, you can't really get mad when my channel has comparable views to yours, and you guys have been posting. You guys have a way bigger base, and your content should definitely be at the point where it's structured. There should be more videos. I mean, there's a lot of things missing. It's just real. Frankly, it's kind of bland. So, just in my personal
Well,
opinion.
it goes back to that everything ain't for everybody. But I
True.
think I think with certain content, especially if it's higher brow, um, you know, I worry sometimes with some of my content because I guess some of the concepts I get into, like for example, I was talking about quantum physics today. I mean, who talks about quantum physics unless you're taking a class on it generally, right?
I mean, if
So
you can make, if you can, Neil deGrasse Tyson's able to find a way. I mean, he sells out conferences talking about it.
yeah,
String theory too.
that's his job. He is literally a physicist, one of the greatest minds on planet Earth in the modern
It's not,
era.
it's
So
not his job to be entertaining.
that's true, but I'm just saying that you know people will aggregate to their
Hmm.
interests, and YouTube is a general format that gives people access to things that maybe they normally wouldn't. I mean, most of these topics are pretty dense, and people that really follow it, it's really hit or miss. I think it's just a matter of a get in where you fit in dynamic. But I can also see why people would be on the frustrated angle of it all. If they're constantly putting out certain content that is dense and they're animated in this spirit of trying to be useful and nobody
Hmm.
supports it, there's a that's really a big issue that helped kill a lot of steam in the pro-black movement in general. Like, I'm not even going to get into a lot of the other things that were going on, such as COINTELPRO and the usurpation of it from the Alice Walker camp. But at the end of the day, it's a human tendency to be frustrated when your efforts aren't reciprocated. So the only thing you can do is, if that's the response you're getting, you're gonna just have to respond accordingly and reach out to other people who may listen, or leave it as
Change your
is.
content,
I
maybe
mean,
a little bit, tweak it,
they
maybe
may be able to adjust it, maybe, but I mean, it's all a dice roll. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and tell anybody what they should do with their channel. And Pookie, I know who you're talking about now, so I'd rather leave it alone for now, because I understand exactly why they've been frustrated in the past about this, and I kind of
I
see
kept it
why.
ambiguous.
I know, but Pookie, you already understand how a lot of these things can create these turf misinterpretations almost on purpose,
Oh
and
Lord. Okay.
you know
Okay.
how it goes. You know how it goes. But the
Okay.
point
All
still
right.
remains the same, that if you want to see something different, you just got to do something different, and people are going to respond in a way that they can relate to. And there are many people I find that don't talk about certain things, or they don't participate in certain things, because maybe they're intimidated by the content, maybe they're intimidated by the information. There's this weird tendency for human beings to not engage in things that may be in their best interest. I mean, we see this all the time. I do the fitness thing. I see this on a routine basis. it, it would be as simple as people just making simple lifestyle changes that they're in full ability to control on, but they just let that limbic system do all the work on autopilot, and they continue to follow in the habits that they had coming up, and they don't do anything to change it. I mean, this is just an aspect of human behavior in general. So I don't see a reason to get frustrated by it. But I understand why somebody would be. I just personally, I place it where it should be and just keep it moving. So if there was a
True.
particular individual that had an issue with that, I mean, it's on them. I mean, I understand, I see the frustration, but at the end of the
True.
day, people are going to be responding to what they believe they can relate to and find use from. And I'm sure it's there. They just need to have that aspect to click, and I really hope it does for them soon. But
Yeah, just give it time. I mean, And I don't know how long they've been posting for it, but I mean, it took BDS a couple of years. This shit ain't
Yeah,
easy, bro. It's a grind, and you
yeah,
got to get ahead. And if you're not ahead, you behind. On YouTube, if you're not ahead, you behind. If you're not in front, if you're not, what Kevin say? What Kevin say? He say, if you want to be in this business, you got to be fucking what he say? You got to be on the iron. You got to be first on the iron. You got to strike. Yeah, that's what he say. You got to strike while the iron is hot, and you got to be first. And in marching call, Jeremy Irons also said, I mean, he was representing a high level corporate executive. So we talking about the highest levels of finance, business, and you see what the mentality generally is. Either you got to be first, or you got to be mad off. You got to cheat, or you got to be smarter. But it's always a hell of a lot easier to just be first and just be ahead and just post and just grind and not worry about the numbers and the stats and all that. Because I mean, once you get to a certain level of videos, I mean, your algorithm's gonna get spread. So I mean, the
yeah,
space is growing. So it is what it is. Like, just give it time. Like,
yeah. There's
we
this
taking.
concept. There's this concept I really like putting forward. I did a little short on it called Kaizen. It stands for incremental improvement over time. And I think that's a principle I apply to myself in the martial arts, what I do with work, what I do in my personal life, and how I approach a lot of the content here. You know, I'm constantly looking at different things that relates to these things. The sword forms is just one aspect. I have a lot of other things I want to introduce with regards to this, and it's just a process. It takes a little bit, and I just try to be a little bit better today than I was yesterday. And even
Yes,
if it's
sir.
just a tiny grain of salt better, you know, it's still better. So, and I keep it in relation to where I'm not competing with anybody else. I understand the concept of being first, and I guess maybe I did some writing on that before. I guess my interpretation of that is, for me, I'm not trying to be first. I'm trying to be the best I can be in the moment when it matters. It's like you don't have to be the fastest person in the world. You just need to be faster than your opponent at that particular time. And that's a very different thing. And it helps you really allocate different resources within yourself that you can draw to be the best expression of yourself that you can be at any particular moment, using honesty, being willing to employ all of that in a given moment. In swordsmanship, the concept of that is called kinnosen, or to intercept and forestall the opponent. It allows for you to recognize what's going on in the environment, and that allows you to act before the environment, producing the phenomenon that you're describing, Pookie, about being ahead
Mm.
and first. But that
But
has to
it's not. It's
go ahead.
But I just want to clarify that just for a moment, because it's not even always about being actually first or being actually best or actually winning. Because it's always a battle against yourself. Because it's never about the opponent. You never focus on what they're gonna do. You're focusing on what you're gonna do. You're focusing on how you're gonna respond, how you're gonna carry yourself. Like, and you have to have that mentality in order to be the best version of yourself, to know that, hey, I'm going to put myself out there as whatever it may be, whatever people may think of me, how I'm perceived, regardless of all that. I'm going to put my best foot out there in accordance, in the chance of winning, regardless of the odds, regardless of what stands in front of you, or what kind of fear you may have about anything you're doing. It's
Mm,
like everybody, it's like a mentality. It's like everybody wants to make the NBA in 5 minutes.
right.
It's like everybody wants to, they want to be Michael Jordan tomorrow. I'm like, keep shooting your free throws, dog. People asking me how you get like that, how you able to shoot your shots from deep, how you able to how you able to stay so poised with these pump fakes and these half turn moves and these fade off the dribble jumpers you able to pull off. I mean, it's like you think there's the cheat to this. How do you think? Because I don't practice this shit for hours with nobody out here. I done ran this shit in games and daily, consistently. I have practiced this shit in the snow, in the rain, in the sleet, in the sun, in the cold, through Corona. It doesn't matter. Like
You know what it
it
is?
doesn't matter.
What it is ultimately in the ADO social complex in particular, there is a tendency to overvalue natural talent and to view individuals that work for the same thing much less. In fact, if you take two accomplishments and one person did it without trying and one person did it after working very hard at it, even if the person that worked very hard at it is very superior to it, the individual that did it without trying with no effort is celebrated far more in our social complex than the one that put forth effort. So much so that putting forth effort is almost seen as a form of cheating in a way, like this kind of like it cheapens the ability to do it. And that concept, that value system spills into a great deal. It's oftentimes the people who give the image of being, quote, natural and who don't try. They're given all the acolytes and they're given a lot of the attention and the resources, even though they're the least likely to actually be able to put it to use, which is odd. It's very
But
odd. But
there's always somebody better though. What happens when you meet somebody who has just as much talent as you but puts in more work? What happens then? Are you still going to be celebrated when you lose to them because you weren't prepared? And usually these talented individuals end up making these excuses.
oh yeah,
Like
that
it's something that I
anybody
want to do that I
most
always that I what I really am pursuing to grow into and mature into and growing into my manhood is to just be honest with myself and what's actually happened. Just be able to be honest regardless of the criticism or what I think other people or how they're gonna perceive. You know what I'm saying?
I think it's interesting because when you talk to a lot of professional coaches, when you listen to them talk about people who are talented, they kind of get irritated because 9 times out of 10, it's the people who are really talented that don't make it. I think it's really interesting. It's rare to find people who are talented and put in the work. That is a profoundly rare instant in reality. And that's with everything. You talk to a lot of gymnastic coaches, they'll get these prodigies that are like 7, 8 years old, and they'll be wanting to train them, but because they're prodigies at it and they're so intrinsically talented, the effort required to get to that 1% incremental improvement over time, that emotional investment, building that muscle memory, doesn't happen. The interest isn't there. And so what ends up happening is, yes, there's a bunch of people, there's a bunch of talent that's there that could be cultivated, but it gets skipped over because they want to look for the individuals that are already demonstrating some form of talent rather than investing, failing to realize that, especially in younger ages, sometimes people are later bloomers. I think they more recently did an examination of this fact when they looked at the birth dates of a lot of soccer and hockey players. And they found that most of the people who were in the professional and semi-professional leagues, even in the college leagues, their birthdays were overrepresented in the first 3 months of the year. So you had a majority of birth dates in January, February, and March. It's something crazy, like 80% of the birthdays of the people on the team. Mathematically, that doesn't even make sense, right?
Which is crazy. My birthday is in March, which is
Okay,
crazy. And it's you know what crazy.
so
It took for me to go down there, and I had to go play actual CBA players,
so let me
which
show
is
you what
something
they found
else.
out. Let me show
Hmm.
you what they found out. At the end of the day, the reason why they were doing this is because when they were looking for talent when they were younger, you're about 8, 9 years old. How much can you grow in a matter of 6-7 months. Crazy amount, right?
Yeah.
So those kids that start the school year in January, February, March, they're actually older than a lot of the other kids there. So when you're older and you've got that much of a physical difference, you could have some talent, but they may just be younger than the person that's there by a couple months and they haven't hit a certain growth spurt yet. So when you do your tryouts to look and see who you're going to cultivate, you've got a huge bay of talent that ends up getting ignored because there's just people who've simply grown a little bit more than they have. And so, like, things like that get completely skipped over and overlooked on a systematic level. And the systematic result of that ends up being that certain people who may not have been the best choice get all the resources, get all the attention, get all the coaching to progress, when there were others that definitely could have done the same thing. And it's not a matter of the individual failing, it's the system that the individual was subjective to failing to account for
Mm-hmm.
potential. You see what I mean? And I'm just
Account
tying that,
for them.
yeah, account for their potential, account for their existence. If they had waited, like, say, the middle of the year to do it, for example, that would have given them a more accurate understanding of who they were dealing with. And they could have potentially had someone who was profoundly more talented and suitable for whatever they were looking for, but never got the chance because they were overlooked by somebody who just developed a few months earlier than they did, who
Just
ended up
because he
not
got a little bounce.
right. So you may have experienced this before when you were coming up in middle school and stuff like that. Like, I mean, I see this all the time, but it happens on a regular level across multiple spectrums. But, that's a systematic problem that the individual oftentimes gets blamed for. And it creates all these distortions, sticking to the spirit of the topic of the discussion today. And I think it's important, if you're in the spirit of problem solving, to acknowledge little things like that and know how people's presuppositions, especially on a systematic level, can help create these issues. I think parents do this to the kids all the time with a lot of different things. And it's important when people are forming their worldview when they're younger, below the age 7, trying to figure out who they are and where their place is in the world. They develop these habits that maybe have good intentions, but end up hindering them when they get older. And some of those influences, ultimately disdaining the image of hard work and valuing the idea of people having intrinsic talent, because the people who work hard don't get celebrated. The people who get celebrated are the ones that demonstrate a natural talent. And that's where you get the problems. But let me take a second and make some acknowledgments here in the chat too, and acknowledge some cash apps. We got Measly Me that came in with a donation. I appreciate you, Fram. Shout out to you. Oops. And then we've got Lovelina came and joined us. Glad you can make it. Oops. We got Trey Bentley here, or Trell Bentley, my fault. Says Batman puts the work in, Superman has a natural talent. I mean, that's a microcosm of the conversation. Some people would run and compare it to Sasuke versus Naruto, but there's a lot on that too. Naruto had a lot going for him, but let's see. We had NBA fan had said something. He said, given the ethnic representation of Black men in terms of intellectual prowess, do you think it's possible to disassociate your association with an aggregate group for another? Thoughts on overcoming stigmas? I think we have something interesting that many of us here probably experience, and I call it the talking horse syndrome or the talking dog syndrome, where oftentimes we act so different to whatever the cultural expectation is that we end up being this walking contradiction or exception. And it leads to what Gyogami responded to you with ultimately, which is, the ultimate response to it is to form your own in-group. Let me see, where did he make that statement? Is it here? Yes. Yogami states, if those who have your mindset align with each other and join forces towards common goals and mix with women of another group serving your interests, you'd form a new demographic over time. In other words, you'd be able to create and form your own kind of in-group. And it's something that I push quite often. And he said something else. Maybe he took it down. I'm not seeing it now.
You talking to NBA fan?
Yeah, NBA. I'm responding to NBA fan statement. Gyogami had gave him a response, and it was pretty much the same thing I would have told him as well. But forming our own in group is essentially the only way that's really going to happen like that. And on a baseline, the international context is really where the future's at, irrespective of what happens. I think with the onset of the fourth industrial wave, it's making the world so much smaller that the concept of the nation state is already changing. BGS today dropped a book or a video speaking on what's going on with the global warming situation. And irrespective of how it goes down, people are going to be forced to move in if they're not physically moving, they're going to have to politically move. They're going to have to change this concept of individual citizen nation state to this idea of earth global citizen. And I think that the Ados tribe men are probably in the best position to not only take advantage of that, but to take advantage of the status that you have as being one of the original blueprints for human beings and use that as a modality to integrate as a universal man, a universal human being capable of interfacing in any environment, whether it be the physical world or the meta world. What I'm advising and what I'm suggesting and what I'm advocating for is that you understand that with the world getting smaller, there's nothing keeping you here, and that there's nothing but advantages to gain by serving as a kind of moral compass for the world, because nobody has your story. Nobody has your story to come from the deep depths of technically being a artificially semi-domesticated human being to being able to navigate multiple environments and provide value across the world purely because of your presence and what you can bring to other aggregates. I think that is a unique position to be in that is just waiting for certain people to capitalize on. And the unfortunate reality is there's not going to be a lot of us that do take advantage of it all. But for many people in this space, you are approaching or in that position to do that. And I highly advise you look in that direction if it's at all possible for you. And there's a lot of people who are already doing that. Some people who've got experience with that, with the money they've made through stocks or trucking, or folks like myself who've been in the military and I've already done the traveling. I think it's a venue that you should really pursue and seriously consider, because the world is definitely getting smaller and the definition of human being is about to make some radical changes before we see 2100. I promise you that. We cover some of that in that transhumanism video that I did with Dr. Nicole Ali. If you guys haven't seen that again, I definitely suggest you peep it. It's what inspired me to make a lot of these sword forms, in particular sword form 2, getting into environmental mastery. And it's where I made the real realization that the speed that the culture in relation to the speed that the civilization is going, the civilization is outpacing the culture at such a bad rate. Folks in 50 years still won't be ready for the changes that have already happened now due to the advent of cell phones, let alone the technology that they're going to have available to them then. And it's not going to look anything like what it does now at all, so long as we continue on this pace and there's nothing catastrophic that happens. And let's see. Oh, Black Sword. I see you, Famos. He was making a statement about when I was breaking down the particle wave theory. Yeah, he said he remembered reading about that experiment. A photon can act as a particle or a wave, but its behavior changes depending on if you look. Yep, all a matter of perspective. And we were relating that to individual versus group behavior and how individuals will behave on a contextual base So if there's other people observing that individual's behavior, it'll be different than if they were by themselves oftentimes, and how groups of people will behave very similarly in almost predictable patterns like a wave. That ties into the Elliott wave principle and the Fibonacci sequence. They actually use that to predict market trends in the stock market. You know, they've just been able to observe that in aggregate, given enough time, people behave in a very predictable pattern in groups. And it doesn't matter what you apply it to. It could be stocks, it could be any market you can think of. In general, these behaviors can be plotted. There is a good book called, let me get you the name real quick. It is called, go to the library, the wave principle of human social behavior. New Science of Social Science. I'll go ahead and type that in the description. Definitely a good book if you want to get a little bit more information on that idea, that principle of how groups of people behave in a wave pattern in aggregate. And they've been using this to predict stock market trends for almost a century and a half now. It's called the Elliott wave principle. If you guys want to look that up, if you guys aren't already in the tracking things like Bitcoin and whatnot. Let's see. Wave principle of from Robert R. Hector Jr. Here we go. Let's see. We got Frederick Holiday. Get that passport. Indeed, get that passport, fam. It's mandatory. Man, indeed, Gilgami. Salshik says, I've expressed since March 2020 to family and friends that this is the last decade to set their future. Fam, that door is closing so fast. I don't think, for a lot of people, the door is already closed. But it's the trajectory that the next 10 years are about to set for whole groups of people is so set in stone and so profound. I don't think we've had anything similar to this probably since the advent of like fire or something. Like this is, once the fourth wave kicks in, wherever you're at, that's probably where you're going to be at generationally for a long time. And the crazy part is, with the way things are changing as per the current definition of freedom, people are going to be more enslaved than they ever have been, but under the belief that they've never had as much freedom as they will be when this stuff kicks off. That part is truly scary. Welcome back, Pookie. I guess you had a disconnect issue.
Yeah, my bad. I didn't mean to follow up. But that comment, what was that comment you had before?
You're Morgan.
Oh shit. Okay.
Yeah. But let's see. NBA fan says, yep, I'm in the military too. Just wondering if you thought there was a way to preserve FBA history and cultural lineage wise without intercultural dating. Not that I'm opposed to it. I don't know if you're going to be able to avoid going intercultural. Here's really my take on that. If women in the ADOS social complex want an ADOS entity that has any form of autonomy, as it was described by Booker T and Garvey and everybody else, they're going to have to very much so make the decision to form coalitions of women that are willing to, one, highlight themselves as being exceptions to the norm right now, and two, be willing to exercise the power that they've been given by the government and the aggregate to enforce that and really flag themselves as being individuals looking to be force multipliers and not individuals looking to perpetuate the daughters of the trade agenda. That's really it. This is in the hands of them at this point, because men who can are going to just take other options. And that's really what this boils down to. And it's unfortunate. I'd love to see it another way, but you can't make somebody do anything. And this is the point we're at right now. You can't expect human beings or men in general in the adosocial complex to uphold a social contract that they're the only ones fulfilling the margins on. It's gotten so bad that they're getting in the way of the people that want to be their slaves. It's crazy. It's crazy. They have gone that overt, that off the deep end. And unfortunately, there's just not enough women that are in the exception that know how to flag themselves as being different, and they're not aggregating with other women who share the same views, that are willing to apply punishments and rewards to women who are not on that program. And if you observe human behavior, this is not only what other groups of women have done, this is how women have always operated, especially if you take it back to the cultural distant root on the continent. Groups of women govern other groups of women. It's that simple. It's really that simple. And if they want a form of what that's going to look like, and if they want this to form in the modality of especially if they want it to look like a nuclear family model, that's the only way it's going to work. Men are no longer in a position in society, unless they just take women's rights away, which that's not happening. You're going to be met with this hive dynamic, which you got your select men that get to be drones that sit around and procreate. They have no other power outside of vitamin D. They're living off their dick, as it's so called. And you're going to have the majority of other individuals, irrespective of what their gender is, functioning like non-reproducing females. That is the hive. That is precisely how a hive works. It's ruthlessly efficient, and it's probably the most efficient model that nature has to offer. And that's the future a lot of people are looking into. And if that sounds familiar, it's because that's exactly how the plantation worked. Exactly how the plantation worked. But instead of honey, they were making cotton. They were making tobacco. Some were making sugar cane. Some were making rice. It's the same principle. But digressing a little bit on that. But I mean, that's really the only answer, NBA fan, unfortunately. At least that, from my subjective opinion, I'll say. That's what I see. That's what's consistent with other things I've observed. Trey Bentley says, Neo manifest destiny. We ADOS need to embrace moving multidimensional, moving to the stars, as well as moving metaphysically. I mean, yeah, you got to have a multilingual, a multidimensional, as you said, vector of movement. We can't isolate ourselves to just this one sphere if we want to be able to have initiative in these other spheres that are being created, because they are going to have the ability to influence both worlds. You know, things that occur in the metaverse. There's going to be things you can get with this virtual property that could leave you financially well off for the rest of your life. And if you're stuck on this idea that, okay, well, I'm not going to do it because it doesn't seem natural, that's one potential resource that you don't have access to now. And even if you don't, you absolutely need to have some people who have your vested interest in mind to make that happen. You need to know how this stuff works so that when laws inevitably form to help govern these things, you're not left in the dark, and how people can walk in and get the best of the better deal over you so that they can use their understanding of it to manipulate you. The same way we see this happen with the gentrification process. I mean, I go back again to how, a lot of the problems we're dealing with in the ADOS tribe has to do with our failure of recognizing the difference between a subject and a citizen. We're not fully aware of what it is that you are entitled to as a citizen, what that word means, what you can do economically, legally, and politically, because that is your status. We function like we're subjects because that's the last save point we have as far as participating in a greater society for the most of us. And there's a big difference in the way other groups of people behave who recognize this and act differently. Even if they have less numbers, because they understand how those rules work, they posture themselves and aggregate in positions of authority and can make great change and procure great power, not just force, power. We said the difference between force and power is that vector of movement called time and duration, time and space. Force is momentarily, power is longevity. That's the difference. We need to value not just force, but power. You can only do that with an aggregate. Oh yeah, Lindy, I think, was speaking about what I said about what's about to happen, with folks that don't get into understanding these changes that are incoming. If you don't posture yourself within the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to be hard stuck there for probably the next century. And for the majority of the people around you that'll be stuck with you, they'll be thinking that they're experiencing the best thing that they've ever seen in their lives. And this last century is probably going to have all kind of distortions used to describe it all. And you're just going to be sitting there in horror as you see people just completely gaslight the truth about how this worked and what actually happened in this time period. See how these concepts, these conversations are just completely warped and distorted to something that gets used to control even more people in the future. All because knowledge won't be based on firsthand experience, but something they read on an article that they can download from some Snaps application or neurological application in their mind. They'll have Google that's in some sort of interface that directly interfaces with the part of their brain that sees things. They don't have to physically go somewhere. They looked it up on Metaverse. They got Google connected to their head. I mean, this is what information is going to look like. And that's a problem already that we know, because the brain already doesn't really distinguish between what's real and what's not real. And if that's already being challenged and compromised with a lot of this technology that's forming here, I really think things like terms like neurotypical, look that nonsense up, are going to start floating around, where people who have different spectrums of autism are going to be the norm for human beings, because other aspects of sociology will atrophy to the point where they're no longer being used. And this term neurotypical, people who don't have some sort of spectrum of autism like that, are going to be seen the same way the alphabet community sees someone who's, quote, cisgendered. The way folks talk about it, it's like something wrong with you if you don't have some sort of deviant skew, or to even call it a deviant skew is a problem. It can be classified as slander or some sort of attack on someone. Mark my words, neurotypical. Look that word up. Keep saying the alphabet dynamic is going to open the gates for the transhumanist dynamic. And very soon, the definition of what it means to be human is going to be unrecognizable by 2100, probably sooner. And it's going to follow the same language, and it's going to usurp. That alphabet movement is going to usurp the feminist movement. It's already happened. They just don't know it yet. It's like that meme from North Star. Omae mo shinderu. You are already dead. That movement is already done. They just don't know it yet. They been got hijacked. But they'll see the end result. And it's why, again, at the end of the day, that hive model very likely is the future. And understand that will be not only a scroll, but it's going to be a deep topic of conversation. I highly invite you guys to come sit in on and definitely contribute, because I think it's very important to recognize the end game for what it is so that you can plan accordingly. Because it's not a matter of if it's going to happen, it's likely already in the works. Pay attention to what your kids are learning in school. Look at the type of media that's being put forward. Listen to the kind of messages that are being put forward. It all lines up. It's concerning, and it really shows how far behind the ADOS social complex is in this conversation, let alone the average person, really. But you already know the axiom in America with us as a whole. When everybody else gets a cold, we get pneumonia. And now we're getting one without an immune system, basically. I mean, that's where it's at. I still stand on the fact that, if there's this idea to fix it, women are going to have to form their own aggregate and provide benefits and punishments against other women that are being antagonistic towards it. And They're going to have to make a decision on whether or not they want the nuclear family model anymore or not, because it is going out of style. It is going belly up for anybody not in that top 5%. And that's for everybody. And there's going to be no way to outpace it. It's happening globally. It's going to be the only way that they can introduce this dynamic that has to be put forward so other groups of people can compete with each other in this what's soon to be interplanetary race. Please believe China did not invest all of that money getting a rover out there on Mars so they can just stare at rocks all day. There are sovereignty lines being drawn out there. And one of the few things that is keeping us from being out there having Star Wars literally is just having the resources to make things stable out there. They're waiting for the human microbiota program to finish up. They're already in places like Antarctica testing these things out, observing what happens to the human biome when it's in isolation in extreme conditions for a long time. They're already noticing certain genetic mutations that are happening with the gut biome and certain epigenetic changes that are happening to the people who get exposed to those conditions. And they're calibrating groups of people to grow up pre-calibrated to deal with those extreme environments, so they can be the explorers that go out and represent, these major entities, states, so that they can compete for resources out in space. That's where we're headed. If you guys saw the Super Bowl, you saw that commercial, Team Earth. They're already setting the trend for that. It's just like that whole me, my, I conspiracy. I know I got the tinfoil hat thing going on right now, but I mean, if you can see an obvious line of trajectory of effect, I mean, it ends up being, more of just an observation and not some sort of conspiracy theory. I think we see the end results of that 20 years later now. Mission accomplished. But that's where we're headed, fam. And once you know where you've been, you see that pattern, being able to direct where you're going, it's very important. And when that fourth industrial way gets moving, that train isn't slowing for nobody. And nobody knows how the music is going to stop. But please believe they got a plan to get in as many chairs as they can before it does. And the majority of us have already been calculated out of the equation as non-factors. And that's important. But let me make a few acknowledgments while I get ready to wrap up. We got Donovan Woods showing up, man. Fan from the DMV. I see you, Os. Glad you could come in, fam. Say NBA fan says, where do you think the best place for ADOS men to collectively set up shop and create an isolated group in? Third world places like the Island Commonwealth or Sub-Saharan Africa, maybe. I think it's going to be a different answer for anybody else. I think you can go anywhere in the world you want to technically. I think what's going to be important is establishing, one, an online presence, two, establishing a recurring currency in US dollars currently, if it's possible. So we're talking retirement check, some intellectual property you own, stocks, something like that. Form some sort of, steady income in US dollars that you can take advantage of. And just do your personal research. I mean, there's people that are going all throughout South America. They're going to Latin America. There are folks that are going onto the continent. There's some folks that are looking at different parts of Asia, like myself. I think it's going to differ depending on where you go. But the key to wherever you go is you need to recognize and be ready to integrate into the culture. It means learning the language, learning the history, invest in it, because that's going to be an easy ticket for you to move forward. And if you have a online network of folks that you can tap into that have information that could help you out with that, such as what Zoom to Thailand is doing. If you haven't seen his channel, definitely go take a look at that. I think that's the way to go. Do your research, look at what you're comfortable with learning, whether or not you're willing to learn a new language. But be willing to integrate into the spot that you visit at. I don't think there is a best place specifically just for ADOS. I think there is a best space for you as an individual that you need to decide and figure out based on your condition. And, whether it be first world or second world or third world, you need to understand the phase that they're in and recognize that by the time you hit 2050, it's going to look like the current US anyway. So don't go anywhere with the expectation that it's somehow dodging a bullet. The universal language and languages are probably going to be English and Chinese pretty soon, English and Mandarin. So plan accordingly, man. So I always wondered why women don't push back on the alphabet community. They have usurped feminism. They have, but the problem is they've grafted the concept so blindly that, they'd be undermining their own efforts, and they're not willing to shift that inertia that they have going on. They're so dedicated all in that they've got to have the alphabet term included in the same breath, the same way, they were including ethnicity in all of that, which, you already know our stance on it in the aggregate. We push back extra hard on that mess, but that's just how it worked. It started with being on that first wave vibe. Then it grafted civil rights to it, and that's where you got that dynamic. And then ultimately later on, as it gained inertia in the 90s, it grafted the alphabet movement to it. And what's going to happen is just like you saw with the whole concept of the useful idiots. That's going to completely consume and take that over. And that alphabet conversation is going to be all about transhumanism in the next 10 years. Watch very carefully. And I wouldn't be surprised if there was an adjacent conversation about it starting with this neurotypical concept, and they use that to justify different relationships people have with people of varying ages. I'm going to leave it at that and leave you to your imagination to fill in the blanks. It's been talked about already in the Hotep spheres, but this is already being put forward on the legislation piece. There's bills for that get pushed forward for approval every single day. They've got whole organizations that are pushing for this stuff. It's crazy. But, currently it's been non-approved, but who knows, one day I may get a green light from somebody. The Black Brain Trust has a lot of videos on the fourth industrial wave, actually. BGS has talked about it, and I talk about the 4 pillars of it with that video I did with Dr. Nicole Ali. I've got a link to it on my channel. If you go to my playlist and you look at the guest appearances tab, it's there. Or you can go to Dr. Nicole Ali's channel also, and you can probably find it there if you scroll down. So we go into the 4 pillars of transhumanism and related to the fourth industrial wave. But if you guys are really interested in that, I can definitely dedicate more time to really breaking down the fourth industrial wave, because I think it's the most important thing that's going on right now in the modern era that isn't being talked about the way it needs to be. See, gentleman rated. Glad to see you up here, fam. It says Africa, money talks. People respect the fact that you're a Black man that came back. And, depending on where you go, that's been my experience dealing with the African diaspora. I know folks have all kind of horror stories about it, man, but I'll be real with you. Everybody I've met personally from the continent, I've had nothing but positive experiences with them. Seriously. If you just sit down and just have a reasonable conversation with 99% of people, you'd be shocked how appreciative a simple conversation can go, fam. I mean, and it's hilarious. A lot of times I find folks that are, they're fresh off the boat, man. They're busy trying to get you hooked up with somebody that's from their country. As soon as you start having a conversation, it's hilarious. So, I mean, just taking the time and doing the research and not bringing this Western mentality as it's been conditioned in a lot of people here over there goes a long way, and people do respond to it. The rules are different, but if you can peep game, If you can peep game here, you can peep game everywhere. I promise you that. So yeah, don't be afraid of the continent. You just need to understand what time it is when you get there. Yeah, I agree, Trill. I mean, barring some massive catastrophe, I don't think it's an issue. And yeah, the infrastructure issue is an issue for now. But as infrastructure improves, feminism is going to be built along with it. So, one of the huge advantages that the Ados tribe is going to have going to the continent is you already know what's going to happen in the cycle. You can provide some useful information and helping to mitigate the impact because at least you know what's going to happen. At least you know the sequence of events that leads to the eventual collapse and this birth rate decline that is a natural result of what happens in these first world countries when they adopt these ideologies, i.e., the behavioral sinks that were observed with the John Calhoun mouse utopia experiments. See, NBA fan says, I was thinking more as a way of us to have ownership, stake, and promising developing country, just opposed to being a customer class as we are in the US. And, BGS talks a lot about this. He makes the suggestion of, just retiring out there. That way you've got a steady form of income and you can invest in the infrastructure and put yourself in a position to eventually own and influence that. I mean, that was the goal that Garvey was talking about with Pan-Africanism in the first place. That's the whole reason why he created the Black Star Line. And after everything he did, after everything he organized, it was the Black Star Line that got him targeted by COINTELPRO and arrested, locked up, and eventually deported. That's for a reason. If you get that book that he wrote, The Thoughts and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, everything he said 100 years ago pretty much has happened and came forward to being the truth. And everything that he suggested that individuals in the Edo social complex and the Black diaspora in general do still hold true for today. He said science was going to be the key to your freedom. Ignoring it is going to free you. Ignoring it is going to enslave you, and embracing it will free you. And he was 100% spot on. 100% spot on. Just a straight up prophet off of what he said. Let's see. Asada says, agreed. I've been mingling with Africans for decades, problem free. Yeah, see, Asada, man, I don't get it. I hear a lot of people and they have these horror stories, and I don't doubt it happens. And like shout out to Nigeria. I know y'all be getting a bad rap, but man, everybody I know from Niger, man, the moment you show any remote interest in the culture, I mean, it's appreciated, it's respected. And yeah, folks may have words for you being an outsider and all of that, but I'll say this, man. There's a lot more going on in those places than you know. And there's a lot that people assume they know that they really don't. And when you really break down our story to people, especially from the continent, and they hear about what happened and what's going on, the level of respect that I see people demonstrate from the continent, it's nothing like this sense of looking down on or seeing you as lesser. I personally haven't experienced that. A lot of the people that I know that have dealt with the diaspora haven't experienced that either. So I wouldn't overinflate negative experiences certain people have of that. I think it's important to get your own experience, get out there and talk to people and do the research about the areas you're interested in. And you would be shocked at how many people really would be very useful force multipliers for your objectives and being able to create synergistic and at least mutually beneficial situations for your presence there. And even if you don't go there, even making business arrangements abroad is beneficial. Because I can tell you this right now, the ones that are doing that don't have a Y chromosome, and they've got assistance from the world organizations right now. It's interesting. Yeah, I'm in North Dallas, so there's a lot of Ethiopians that are out here. I think you've seen my IG. I go to this stores and that's where I get my injera at, and my berry berry and all of that. There's some Ghanaian folks that live out in this area, man. It's where I get a lot of my ingredients to make fufu. I mean, I still use all of those different things, and I took it for granted because it was such a huge diaspora in the DC area, but even out here in Texas, a lot of them are out here in school because you've got almost 4 major universities within a 30-mile radius of each other in the Dallas area. So absolutely, it's definitely worth it, and you'd be shocked. Saushik says, my family's from Liberia. There are many who were high-paid employees or small business owners in the U.S. been moving back to Liberia to retire. Yeah, and I think for a short while Liberia had that right of return going on. I think they're going to see an influx of more of the African diaspora in general. Go back to the continent, and it can be a very powerful thing. But there is a lot of corruption. They do have the colonial dynamic to take into consideration. But there's something to be said about being in a place that's not in the US where you don't have to deal with the weight of being ADOS here. There's a certain weight that's lifted off your shoulders when you step out of the continental US. And even if you don't go overseas, even if you go somewhere in South America or Central America, there's still that weight that's lifted off of you. And even if you don't stay, I think it really helps you to put the world into context when you finally see how people live outside of this sphere. And you can begin to understand that there's more to being human than being American. It's just you are a human who happens to be American, who happens to be of the ADO social complex. And for all its implications, there's so much more to who you actually are that I think many people give themselves credit for. And there are a lot of opportunities that they can take advantage of and capitalize that would be a benefit to themselves and others around them. And more importantly, others abroad. And people do and will reciprocate that. Please understand that. Because without trust, there's no business. And whether people want to acknowledge it or not, the ADO social complex currently probably has some of the highest moral ground of any group of people on earth next to the small hats. It's the NBA fan. I generally agree with that. Like 85% of my interaction with non-ADOS blacks have been positive, but some of them get out of pocket and disrespect, shouldn't be tolerated at all. I agree, and that's when you respond accordingly. Trust and believe. And a lot of times when I saw that go down, man, a lot of their own people, especially in the DC area, will check them for that nonsense. But that's been my experience with that. I've seen the full spectrum, but in general, my experiences have been overwhelmingly positive. And no different than, meeting other ADOS. And even when I have bad experiences with folks from the tribe, like, we know what it is. We understand what's really going on. And it's why I make it a point to really be present when I see us everywhere. A lot of times we go days, weeks, months without really acknowledging the fact that we exist, man. Like, just seeing a stranger, one of us just randomly down the street, nodding and really saying, "Hey, what's good, fam?" Like, just a real honest acknowledgement goes a long way with people, man. Like, we're really not used to doing that with each other if we don't know one another already. And just creating that air of acceptance with each other, you can get out of seeing that as weakness and seeing it as more of a positive, man. It goes a very long way. It really, really does. Being in survival mode has been almost like a poison for us in the West out here. And when you can finally get somewhere and experience what it's like to have a group of people who see you as a human being first before anything else, it's life-changing. And it's something I think is a requirement for you to experience to truly have that sense of where you belong in the world. You know what I'm saying? It ties loosely back to what I was mentioning with that whole concept of subculture and the need for that. There is a biological need that we have to have some connection with something in a positive way to really be fully human. It's a requirement. And that's something that's chronically ignored. It's like a vitamin that we're deficient of out here in the West, especially in America. So I definitely advocate people moving out. And Ankh is over here making some suggestions. I mean, again, do the research. I had my eye on East Africa for a while. So Rwanda, Tanzania in particular. Tanzania is doing great right now. I don't know too much about Zanzibar, but from what I see, is a really large Arab population out there. But you know, they kind of remind me of Mozambique. It's a lot like that. You know, it's definitely worth looking at all of those areas, man. Got Charles Irby. I lived in Egypt. I felt the weight lifted. I stayed a year in Egypt studying Arabic. I spent a month in Morocco. I enjoyed my time abroad. I'm considering Kenya. Yeah, Kenya's definitely a go-to. Like Kenya's the West Africa of East Africa. It's one of the other places you're gonna find that's predominantly English speaking, and it's got its own vibe. It's real close to Ethiopia, and it kind of is like a gateway to the rest of East Africa. I mean, it's definitely a strong online presence from Kenya as well. So definitely something to consider. But I guess with that, I guess we'll get ready and close up this episode today. Again, we broke down the word kata, form 4, the illusion of exclusion. And hopefully we achieve the goal of providing a different way of looking at yourself in relation to the aggregate. I mean, you are an individual with agency and you are a unique footprint, but understand that there's far more in common that you share with the world around you than what makes you different. And what makes you different isn't something that should be used to hold against you. It should be something that is celebrated. And you can start by celebrating that within yourself and getting to understand that and question your conditioning. Really look into how you became who you are. Respect the idea of being a person because there's people. Understand that you are a shadow of the aggregate that formed you, much like your DNA is a composite of all of the millions of ancestors that it took for you to come across and be what you are now. You didn't get here by yourself. Recognize the fact that 90% of your actions is determined by 10% of your brain. Appreciate the difference between force and power. The difference between them is the relative time under which these things have been applied. Force is temporary, power is indefinite. You are a part of a superorganism. Human beings are designed to function in groups. That is never going to change. For as much as they preach individuality, you are a person because there are people. And the idea of yourself is a required tool to help you navigate the world around you. Because our minds can't constitute and process all of that information, we're able to use ourselves as a proxy. As a result, you have a responsibility of minding your mind. With that said, hope you've been able to find of use of a lot of these concepts. My DMs are always open if you have any requests or if you'd like for me to go over anything that we said before. If we don't have any further questions, then we'll go ahead and close out for the day. And I'll bow out to the sphere. Os, to those who came in and joined me today in the dojo. Definitely appreciate your presence here. Os. I hope you all have a great after or evening at this point. And enjoy the rest of your week and be safe.